to be 17/20. Oh, no, thank you. All right. That'll erase my flub from the record.
Start the record.
I'll call to order the Wednesday, July 17th, 2024 meeting of the Thurston County Planning Commission. The Thurston County Planning Commission is a resident advisory committee of the Board of County Commissioners on land use planning matters such as comprehensive plan and zoning ordinance amendments. Planning Commission actions are in the form of recommendations to the county commissioners, the final decision makers. All Planning Commission meetings are open to the public. Community members are welcome to observe all Planning Commission briefings and work sessions. Public comment is allowed on those topics for which a public hearing has not been held. The first thing, do we need to introduce, I guess, take roll call? Is that the first thing? Yeah, okay. Do you want to help us with that? Do you do that or do I?
Just start with the introduction down here.
Okay, we'll start the introductions to my left.
I'm Eric Casino. I live in the Lacey unincorporated area and I serve the commission at an at-large position.
Scott Nelson, District 4. Bill Fishburne, I live in Rainier, I'm District 4.
Colin Bartlett, I live in Tumwater, District 5 is represent.
Daniel Baumbarger, I live in and represent District 1.
Barry Halverson, Yelm, Washington, District 2.
Sandy Kaiser, Steamboat Island Peninsula, District 3.
Kevin Pessinger, District 5.
And Joel Hanson, I live in Tumwater and serve at large. I would introduce a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, is there any discussion?
We can add discussion of the LRA to the good of the order.
If you like, let's make it official.
Yeah,
I was wondering, we have Andrew Bond here to speak to the LRA topic, but he hasn't been feeling well. Is there a way to respectfully request that it be after
Earlier.
public
Yeah,
comment?
can we do it after public comment? Before
That
new
way we
business?
can let him go to sleep.
Okay. Any objection to adding the LRA discussion after public comment? No. Then all in favor of approving the agenda as amended?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Yes, the next on the agenda is approval of the minutes from the July 10th meeting. Is there any?
accept the
Oh.
official.
Thank you very much. Might be in here. I don't see it,
It's
but
literally just the name. It's
yeah.
I motion to approve the meeting minutes and accept the audio as the official meeting record.
Second.
All in favor? Or any discussion? Any amendments? No, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. I'm getting my sea legs here. Thank you, everybody. Next on the agenda is public communication. We have members of the public in the hearing room here. Do any of you wish to address the planning commission?
We caught you grabbing that.
Oh, great. And how many folks do we have online?
It's like
Just a handful. Okay, thank you.
two of them have their hands up.
Okay. Okay, I'll read the script here quickly. Thurston County Planning Commission welcomes comments from the public at all meetings. Please, when speaking to the Planning Commission, please introduce yourself, including the address you reside at in the county. Please address the Planning Commission, not the audience or staff. The Planning Commission does not respond to public comments. Speakers are limited to a total of 3 minutes. The timer will show on one of the video screens to help keep track of time. Meeting attendees cannot donate their speaking time to another person. No comments that are lewd, offensive, inflammatory, hateful, defamatory, or discriminatory in nature, and no comments that are commercial in nature. All material provided to the county may be subject to release pursuant to the Public Records Act, and remarks on projects that have already had a public hearing are not permitted. Thank you for your cooperation. First on our list is, I believe it says Gordon Wheat. Is that correct? Yes. You're, please approach the podium and address the commission.
Dear members of the County Planning Commission, My name is Gordon Weed. I reside at 1617 East Bay Drive, in Olympia. I'm a public health physician, a board member of the Thurston Climate Action Team, and I've spearheaded the development of the Thurston County Extreme Heat Emergency Response and Illness Prevention Plan for our county. This plan was recently adopted by our county hazard mitigation plan. It was rated very highly for urgency of implementation by the Emergency Management Council and endorsed by the Board of Health and the county commissions. As you consider the addition of a climate element to our county comprehensive plan, I hope that you will recognize the importance of resilience to extreme heat events here in Thurston County. One of the areas at highest risk in the whole United States for mass casualties from extreme heat events is the Willamette Valley, the Puget Sound, and the Fraser River Valley. In other words, right here. In Fraser River Valley in British Columbia. And ironically, this is because we are generally a heat refuge compared to much of the United States, but we will be seeing greatly increasing incidence and severity of episodic extreme heat events. Because of our benign history, our population is not prepared for heat emergencies, does not understand the risk of extreme heat, and our buildings are designed to retain heat and generally lack air conditioning. Extreme heat events are now by far our greatest risk for mass casualties as compared to all other disasters. It's hard to recognize the implications of being on an exponential curve when the curve is still relatively flat, but our planet is still on the same exponential curve of global warming. And we're guaranteed to stay on that exponential curve, at least in the near future. This means we will see more frequent and severe extreme heat events, and the exponential curve is starting to get much steeper. The June 2021 extreme heat event killed more than 4,000 people in the Vancouver, BC area, and approximately 440 people in Washington state, even though the heat dome was centered over British Columbia. Of the 619 people who died immediately during the 6 days of the event in the Vancouver area, 98% of those died in their own homes, and 28% of those never even called 911. And even if they did call 911, they were sometimes on their own, as the Medic 1 equivalent there was overwhelmed, and they were forced to tell people that they couldn't send any response when the heat was at its worst. We're very busy right now in formally writing our extreme heat plan for our county. And we will have future extreme heat events, which make the June 2021 event a mild event by comparison. We are working to improve our emergency response, but we also know that the only way to save a much greater number of lives from future extreme heat events will be by prevention. As you prepare the climate element, I hope to work with you to incorporate various heat resilience strategies that may save many more lives than the improvement in our emergency response.
Gordon, can you wrap it up? Your time is up, so can you
Okay, these include,
skip to the conclusion?
Let me just say that you may have heard that the Thurston Climate Action Team has received a Commerce Department grant to help specifically with the climate element of the comprehensive plan by hiring a full-time staff member, and we hope to be of assistance to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I would ask that as that plan is available, could you send it to the staff so that it can be part of our discussion?
Well, yeah, the plan is being written. It's going to be a process for writing the plan. And so the formal plan will not be adopted for some period of time. And certainly we'll get it to you as soon as we have the formal plan written. Right now, we're meeting with all the emergency management people in the county and the hospitals and the ERs and the emergency management people in public health. And it's a big team that's working on developing a plan. But mostly what we've been working on so far is developing our emergency response so that we can respond to the surge in victims that is likely to occur with the community.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you. And I think I would probably speak for the entire planning commission that as much information as we can have to develop this chapter from scratch is useful. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I could give you much more information and present to you again in more detail if you'd like.
Perfect.
Yeah, just as in addition to that, if you would be so kind as to, I know you had more information that you were wanting to share on your script that you had there. If you wouldn't mind passing that over, I'd be interested to see what we missed.
You want to review my notes? Yeah. Okay, don't mind.
We can also scan it and send it out if you feel comfortable with that.
I appreciate that. That's fine.
Be
Kind
great.
of have like my handwritten.
Oh.
Edits and so forth, because I just wrote it up a few minutes ago.
Oh.
Next on our list for public comment is Mary Ann Tompkins.
Thank you, Planning Commission. My name is Mary Ann Tompkins. I reside at 1004 73rd Avenue Northeast, Olympia, Washington. And I want to talk about housing and land use. And first, I want to acknowledge that there are poor people living rural and not very well. And I have been there, done that. The National Advisory of Health and Human Services does state that low income or poor people living rural are less visible to health and human services. And it's very concerning, especially for low income children that need services because they're hidden. Rural communities lack the necessary infrastructure to meet the needs of poor, especially the homeless. And if we create infrastructure for services in the rural areas, we lose our rural lands. Compared to urban areas, rural communities have fewer specialized services. They have no shelters and trained staff to address low income, poor, or homelessness. The majority of people that I knew that lived in poverty did not want to live rural. This is a ruse to allow development in rural areas, I feel, instead of focusing on solutions in the urban core. It just isn't realistic. It's not going to create equity, and I believe in equity, and that narrative is diversity washing. I really don't want to buy into the developer's messaging, and I hope you don't as well. I mean, I want an oceanfront property with a view, but I can't afford that. It's not the government's obligation to provide what everyone wants, but to help provide what is needed. And the need is affordable housing in urban areas close to services. So I know that somebody talked about cluster housing and what's really the value of a mobile home park that's far away from services. I think ADUs are very popular, and it's what the developers are talking about. And if you think that people on acreage wanting to build an ADU for extra income are going to rent to low income and the disadvantaged, I don't think so. This will allow the rich to get richer by providing another source of income. It'll increase property value. So I'd like to know who's really advocating for this. Is it people in poverty, the homeless advocates, landowners, and developers? It might sound like a solution, or sounds like they have a solution for a problem that doesn't exist. So cluster housing in rural areas will destroy a lot of trees. It would be pushing urban growth into rural lands. It will create density, and you can't protect our farms and forests and allow cluster housing. I really feel it's a way to get wealthy landowners to have far more for their land and become wealthier. Density and services for the low income belongs in the UGA. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on our list is Rhonda Larson Kramer.
I'm Rhonda Larson Kramer. I live at 1814 East Side Street in Olympia. I also have 20 acres of forest land in the county. I also wanted to address some comments I heard at the last meeting. I can understand the view I heard that was expressed that it's unfair that high-income people can get to live in the country, but low-income people, is too expensive for them to do the same. And it seems like a good idea to help make it possible for low-income people to live in rural areas if they want to. Rural living is beautiful. I grew up in the woods in the middle of nowhere, so I can relate to that very much. But we may be drawing conclusions that are not based on the ground experience from the point of view of a person who is actually low income in a rural area. When I grew up, it took 20 minutes to get to school by car and 1 hour to get home from school if I took the bus. My family could afford gas for multiple cars in the household. I ask that when you consider helping people live rurally, you factor in the costs of transportation. It's not ideal to live that far out and be low income, even if your rent is affordable. And if your car breaks down, you're really in trouble. Equity does not mean making housing affordable in rural areas. It's not affordable to have to drive far to services. And social isolation is a problem for other reasons too. There will always be people of all incomes who want to live far away from other people. We can all understand that. But the percentage is so small for those who lack resources to afford gas that it's not something the county should be building a zoning code on. If the county does build a zoning code around this, it will have unintended consequences. Creating cluster housing zoning puts a big develop here sign on all rural lands. We can all agree that there are a fair amount of low-income people already living rurally, as was just referenced, including in unauthorized living accommodations like campers without proper hookups. Many of those living there are doing so because they don't have better options, not because they like country living. Increasing housing options in rural towns is a much more equitable approach. The county has the planning staff that rural towns don't have. The county can help towns like Rochester, Grand Mountain, Yelm, and Bucota. This is where the county really can make a difference in contributing to an increase in supply of housing stock for people who don't make a lot of money. Another thing the county can do is encourage cities to use creative zoning to increase affordable housing. For example, cities can create zoning that requires developers of new development to either include affordable homes or contribute to a city fund for the preservation and production of affordable housing. Another example would be to give developers the freedom of additional development capacity in exchange for them either including affordable housing units or making a payment to fund affordable housing in the city. Thank you.
Thank you. Last person on our list, I think it might be Betsy. Right?
Hi, I actually have two statements. The first one's for Black Hills.
Betsy, what's your full name and address, please?
My name is Betsy Norton, 1405 Evergreen Park Drive Southwest, number 3. I live in Olympia. And I'm speaking, these comments are from the Black Hills Audubon Society Conservation Committee. We submitted comments related to chapter 9, but they actually apply to climate change as well. In general, we support the document with the document that's been drafted with the following improvements. We want to add wildlife viability as a major challenge due to habitat loss and climate change. We want to protect beaver dams as critical habitat infrastructure and as a key component of natural ecosystem services. We would like the comp plan to recognize biodiversity as an important resource for the county and to prioritize the need to protect habitat, including connected habitat and wildlife to maintain its benefits for the residents of the county. We would like the comp plan to strengthen and expand the county's goals for protected water resources to ensure there is sufficient water quality and water quantity to meet not only the needs of people, but also wildlife and ecosystems in the county. We would like you to expect the list of water pollutants to expand and plan and fund the county resources to protect water from these emerging contaminants. We'd like you to expect climate change and increased population demands to create challenges to maintaining water quantity availability all year round, and to plan to expend county resources to help mitigate that variation. both for the health of people and for the health of wildlife and their habitats. And finally, we'd like you to monitor and adapt the execution of the Thurston County HCP to ensure it actually protects listed species. So that's it for Black Hills. I would like to just make a brief comment on the PowerPoint for the climate change chapter and say, first of all, there's very little for wildlife in there. We need to see more for wildlife in there because wildlife are the most. The second thing is that I saw in there, they were talking about setting climate goals and trying to figure out how to meet greenhouse gas commitments. I thought you guys already had a report on how Thurston County was doing regarding those that came out in January of 23. We've been citing that, and it would be nice if that was reflected in that analysis. And then thirdly, I'd like to see when you're talking about vehicle miles traveled, I think it's really important to break out commercial use that's generating the greenhouse gases. And particularly, I would look at transportation industries that are heavy trucks that are generating probably more of that than individuals with automobiles. So,
Thank you.
You said that you submitted these comments?
yeah, I submitted them online.
Okay.
And I'm not sure exactly where they ended up.
Oh, they've been shared with the planning commission. So when we reviewed chapter 9, those were the comments that got shared. We can reshare them as part of the climate discussion.
Yeah, it'd be handy to be able to reference those in this context.
Yeah,
Thank you.
because I have references and links and stuff.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
I remember correctly, we addressed some of them at that meeting as well.
yeah, you provided direction for updates to chapter 9, and so we're working on those and a lot of that stuff. So we got.
Do we have anyone on, looks like we have at least 2 people online that would like to address the planning commission.
Let's do this.
Okay, we'll start with Loretta Sepinen. Just take a moment here and.
Hello, I'm Loretta Sepinen. I live in Southeast Olympia, Washington. I want to add 2 policies to your discussion tonight related to climate change for your consideration. And these 2 policies relate to one of the gap areas that your consultants are going to present to you. And that gap area is ag and food systems. First of all, in terms of the resilience aspect of climate change, because of where the extreme heat is going to happen, we're going to need to figure out how to protect our food security. And so that's the policy I want to talk about. The heat map that the consultants are going to show you has an area in the southwest corner of the county around the Chehalis River that has the most heat problems. And it happens that that's going to be a problem not just for the people who live there and not just for the salmon in the Chehalis River, but there is going to be likely a reduced production from our very productive farms that are in that area. And so the policy that we need in response to that for food security reasons is to support abundant agriculture production elsewhere in the county as well, so that we can compensate if we lose some of the production that is right now happening in that part of the county. In terms of emissions reduction, the Sustainable Thurston Plan, as well as what the consultants are telling you about, says that one aspect of that is carbon sequestration. And right now, carbon is being sequestered in the plants and on the farms. And yet in this analysis, that's not given any quantity. It's treated as if that might always just stay the same. We are sequestering carbon. It's not zero right now. It can go negative. We can go below whatever the amount is that we're sequestering at this moment. And that will happen if we start losing our farmland. It's disturbed by having development created there. So what we need and what other areas in the nation have done is have robust funding for a like Conservation Futures, but a whole lot more of it, to fund purchase of agricultural conservation easements that would pay farmers for the development rights so that their land is stays as it is, sequestering carbon as it is, and not having carbon released. I thank you for the opportunity to bring up those two policies for consideration.
Thank you, Loretta. Next would be David Taylor. Okay, they'll be moved to the Toyer, sorry.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. It always kind of freaks me out a little bit when you're joining as a panelist and it like resets and restarts and I kind of lose audio of you all. But thank you for the opportunity to speak this evening. David Toyer with Toyer Strategic Advisors. We're a land use and economic development consulting firm. We've had the pleasure to work on a few different projects in Thurston County and its cities. And one of the things I wanted to do tonight was kind of maybe go back and address a couple of things that have come up in your last few meetings. There have been a few comments in the public comment time period that address UGA swaps, as well as have raised some comments on the bar holdings proposal, which is a proposal on the docket that will come before you a little bit later this year. First of all, I just wanted to kind of address UGA swaps as the tool that they are. And that kind of needs to be a distinction between the tool of UGA swaps and then any proposal that you might consider under that. UGA swaps were first allowed by the legislature in the 2002 session with engrossed substitute Senate Bill 5593. That added a provision for counties and cities to be able to evaluate changes to UGA boundaries using the swap methodology and framework at the 10-year comprehensive plan updates. Now, separately, this last legislative session here in 2024, the legislature also, in a unanimous vote in both chambers, approved substitute Senate Bill 5834, which adopts a very similar set of kind of policies and decision criteria for analyzing UGA swaps on an annual basis. The legislature looked at this very carefully in the vein of housing as a topic of major conversation, but also the fact that we have areas in urban growth boundaries, not just in Thurston County, but all over the state of Washington, that have not developed and really don't have development potential due to a number of reasons, whether they're heavily encumbered by critical areas or they have severe issues with being able to serve them with infrastructure because the cost would be too high and those sorts of things. I'd really ask for the commission to kind of withhold, from trying to compare the policy to any projects and make sure that you evaluate in your land use chapter and the countywide planning policies the need to reflect what the legislation has enacted. And then just separately, I wanted to say tonight that on behalf of the folks working on the bar holdings project, we really are looking forward to the opportunity to come before Planning Commission when that is a topic on your agenda. And we're very happy to address some of the questions that folks have had and expressed over the last several weeks. And also think that's the most appropriate time to walk through the merits of that application relative to the statutory requirements that it's seeking to comply with. So I really appreciate your time this evening and thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Toyer. Just for the record, could you state your address really quick so we get that in the public record?
Yep, certainly. It's 3705 Colby Avenue, Suite 1 in Everett, Washington, 98201.
Thank you. Okay. Unless anyone else online wants to address the commission, I think that's the end of public comment for tonight. Okay, thank you.
Marion and Brennan had their hand up earlier. It's
Okay.
down now. I don't know if they changed their mind.
Marion, it was noticed that your hand was up earlier. Do you wish to address the planning commission? You can signal by raising your hand. Nope, looks like,
No,
okay. Thank you for that. It was a mute button or symbol, I think. Okay, next on our agenda, I guess, is going to be item 4, new item 4, which will be the LRA discussion. And
so just before the meeting, well, a little earlier today, we got a copy of the draft of the letter that that staff will be presenting with proposal, and particularly the comments from the attorney, I know generated some conversation before the meeting, and I thought it would be useful for us to have a chance to talk about those.
Well, has already read it, and does anyone need it passed around?
I haven't seen it.
haven't seen it yet either. Andrew, are you prepared to speak to this?
I can just run generally through what is within the memo. It's about 5 pages, so I can't really read it to you.
Oh, sure. Sure.
So more or less how the memo is laid out is very typical with how we do our memos. There's a purpose statement regarding why we're coming to the board. We then dive into the background of the different facilities that the state of Washington has for these for the sex offenders. Then we touch on the proposed changes that you all saw for the public hearing. Then we go into the PC motions and additional recommendations where we highlight both motions that were given to us regarding both moving the project forward, as well as the newer one that touched on compliance, permitting, and security, the kind of overarching motion that kind of touched on some of the additional recommendations the Planning Commission put forward. Then there was a timeline of just what kind of happened from the introduction on April 17th to our work session on the 26th. The enhanced public outreach that we did in addition to our standard public outreach for the public hearing. And then we touch on just general collaboration with the prosecuting attorney's office, highlighting just some of the questions that we received at the different meetings, as well as the prosecuting attorney's responses to those, as well as some of the responses to the additional recommendations the Planning Commission put forward towards the end of our 2 meetings ago. And then it's just attachments and then some next steps with dates. That's kind of the general overview of the memo.
Didn't already share, this has been reviewed by staff in the prosecuting attorney's office, but it has yet to be reviewed by the board's office, so it could go through further changes, but we wanted to make sure we got you what we had so far.
Yes.
Okay, will the letter signed by our chair go forward with this, or is this unclear? Okay. The other question is I didn't see in there where it mentioned changing the title to include state mandated residential facility for sex offenders in treatment.
It was there.
It is in there.
Yeah. So there's an inconsistency there actually that confused me a little bit. When the meeting we had after your first meeting with the attorney, we were advised that the attorney had said that that language was not acceptable and not compliant, but this memo states simply that it wasn't asked that specific title, but it was instead asked on April 18th if just including the term sex offender was okay, and that was a policy call. That doesn't match up to what we were told in the meeting when we discussed that.
My recollection is that that he advises that it was confusing, and what did in treatment mean, and that we were getting further and further away from the state definition, which just led to confusion. But it's still, it's a policy call in terms of what we want to call it. But if we want to be clear to the public and being able to connect what we have in our code to what is in state code.
I think our most recent edits to that title accommodated that concern. but there is no new feedback on that new language in this.
No.
Okay.
We didn't ask him for new feedback on the recommendation. That's yours to own as the planning commission. This was just the feedback he provided that we shared during the planning commission meetings in developing a recommendation.
Okay, so our recommendation to change the word may to must in the 24-hour staffing and trained escorts. What was the decision on that, or was the one even given? What was the recommendation by the PAO?
Oh, he was, that it's not allowed. It is in the letter is, he said that wouldn't be allowed.
I didn't see that in it. I read that thing twice.
Should be in the section with the feedback from the prosecuting attorney's office.
And limiting the number of residents to one fewer than total number of bedrooms in a facility?
Not,
I'm not sure, are you looking at the letter that they sent out this afternoon? Or are you looking at the letter that?
No,
they sent
I've
out
read
last
that
week?
letter. That I gave it to Joel so he
Yeah.
could look at it. I'm looking at the one that we gave. I was comparing the two of them this afternoon, right after we received this. And I didn't see that, these items specifically mentioned in there. Which is concerning to me. That's why I asked if the letter that was signed by our chair was gonna go forward with it too, because I intend to be there on the 7th of August. And I'm just trying to sort this out as to when the PAO made these opinions, was it after receiving the letter from Commissioner Day? Or was
No.
it before?
no, if you recall, you made preliminary recommendations. We had a follow-up conversation with the prosecuting attorney's office, and then we brought that back and asked if you would want to reconsider any of your motions,
Okay.
and you all said no, which
Right.
is totally fine. We have not circled back with him to get follow-up since you decided not to significantly change any of the
Okay.
motions.
It's my understanding that county and city ordinances or regulations can be more restrictive than state or federal regulations. They just can't be less restrictive.
Andrew, do you want to address that?
They can be more restrictive in a land use setting, but this is more tied to actions that are operated through the Department of Corrections. And so if the zoning says you can allow multifamily residential, we have the authority to define what that means. But when it talks about contractual requirements or requirements outlined for types of facilities to meet the criminal side of state law, they have the overarching power. We can equal it, but we can never be less restrictive, nor can we be more restrictive. We pretty much have to align very closely with how they define the requirements. And so that's when you look at our initial proposal that we brought before you. It was very high level. It talked about contractual requirements and then the general life safety requirements that you see for water, sanitation, food handling, and so on.
I was gonna say it doesn't make sense to me. And everything that I've ever seen in federal, state, county, and city government, that does not make sense. I don't understand why the Department of Corrections or DSHS would have authority to do something that the rest of the state and the counties can't. I just don't see it. So
I took particular issue with the idea of requiring re-registration every year, right? Because there's a real concern for me from a safety point that they'll cross their T's and dot their I's to get these built and then neglect them and they become a safety concern. And that is a safety concern for a business operating in the county, which is of concern to Thurston County government. And the feedback from the PAO was, no, this is an additional burden on the applicant without justification. It is a justification. The argument was a safety related one. And all permitting is burdensome, right? But it is within our authority to do permitting. It's the whole reason people can't build whatever they want, wherever they want. It's not, we're not applying this unequally. We're literally just trying to, I don't know. I don't particularly appreciate the editorializing or ignoring our motives from the PAO in this.
And I just, because this is on the record, I just want to make a point of the record. I am not a person that normally would want more or increased regulation. I'm just not. But when we're talking about public safety, I am. And that's what this is going to.
So the intention behind providing our draft briefing form to the board is so that you would be able as a planning commission to write your own narrative letter. And so still open to that. It'd be great if it was done in time to share with the board ahead of August 7th. We have to provide our materials 2 weeks ahead of time. I think you can send yours, whenever it's complete, or you can just provide it, show up in person and then provide it. But we're really not in a position to speak on behalf of Travis.
No, I understand that.
I think we need to be clear about that. We are communicating issues at large and on the record, and we're not communicating them as displeasure towards the folks who worked really hard on getting this to us in time.
Yeah.
Are we expecting Travis to show up to the work session?
He is gonna be at the work session. Part of it's gonna be closed session. So,
Why would it be closed?
I think just so he can share feedback on I think it's more for the board than for Travis.
They can't do an executive session and close a session for that reason.
No, that would be
No,
an
for that
abusive
reason.
executive session.
Commissioner Peshner.
Andrew, could you provide feedback on the structure?
So the structure, at least at this point, it was originally meant to be part open then closed, and then it was decided that it will be fully open. However, if it does go into a realm of legal concern, the prosecuting attorney will bring that to the attention and recommend an executive session.
Thank you, Chair.
I think that's wrong. I'll object under OPMA right now.
Yeah.
But we'll take it up with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I share Commissioner Baumgartner and Commissioner Halverson's concerns. I appreciate the work the staff did, and this is in no way a complaint against any of that. I know that the staff is doing the best they can about this. But I don't feel that either that original letter signed by Commissioner Day nor the follow-up briefing is a accurate representation of the way the conversations went and the way the discussion unfurled. I would even go so far as to say, I think in that letter that was, or document signed by Commissioner Day on our behalf, that there were motions, like it's only listed that there were 2 motions, one to adopt and one to change, to have the county commissioners consider any additional concerns from the public. Then it just says, and all of these other things were recommended. It doesn't have like a motion was made, what the vote was. There was a number of motions. I think maybe one of them that Barry's referring to was missed in even being listed. So at the very least, I would ask for the official record to be corrected, at least reviewed to the audio to see what actual motions were and what the votes were, and have them each individually listed as motions. Because I think we took it that seriously as a planning commission, and we made specific motions and votes on those things.
To my knowledge, we had no objections to any of the motions. That's worth explaining.
There are a couple of references to unanimous choices by us.
The first 2 motions, yeah.
Yes. I'm mystified about not getting this at all, how this was distributed. You said it arrived today?
I got it by email.
By email. I never got it. I double checked everything.
Yeah, we did put planning staff under a bit of pressure for that, but I thought it was important.
Who sent it?
It would have come from,
I got it from Tasha.
Yeah, okay.
did that one come from you, Tasha, or the planning commission at Thurston? Oh,
Yeah.
it maybe it went to, we're trying to shift it over to our planning commission email account so that if Tasha is out on vacation or something like that, anyone can access it.
So it might be my junk folder.
It might be. This was the.
Thank you. Let's say planning commission.
So subcommittee to write the letter? Or just someone wants to take the lead and well, we can't really iterate before that meeting. So we need to basically empower someone to do it.
And when would it be due?
By the day of the meeting.
I would say, yeah, be great to have it by the day of the meeting. I mean, you could provide
We should have it before then, but that at latest it's due the day of the meeting.
the, and you can send things through us. So although you can't email one another, you can send things to the planning commission email, and then it can be distributed to the rest of the planning commission.
I move to request the acting chair consider creation of a subcommittee to draft a response letter for the Board of County Commissioners.
And then that with the, can we amend it to have the authority to produce that on our behalf so that we don't need another thing to approve it?
My motion is only to request the acting chair to consider the creation of it. He can create it however he wants.
Is there a second?
Seconded.
Any discussion?
So I guess, are we asking to respond to the staff report, or are we asking to amend our letter?
I'm asking to respond to the staff report.
Cause I think we send our letter, staff does their report, that's their thing. It's beyond, in my opinion, it's beyond us at this point. It's staff's report that goes to the county commissioners, that goes with our letter.
I think the goal was to provide the missing context and process information, because this was something that we were quite deliberate on for several meetings. And it was heavily condensed in a way that doesn't, I think, give the gravity of how heavily considered and justified a lot of our positions were. And, you know, some of us kind of reject the characterization or the interpretation and opinions provided by the POA. You know,
Our standard briefing forms don't necessarily capture the planning commission's intention.
No.
That was our understanding going into it, that was something that we were going to have to provide.
We've been pretty clear that we're it's not really the format, but the planning commission is welcome to share that.
I just, who can be there on the seventh?
Sorry, that's
Myself.
I'm trying to
relevant to the
write my
motion on the floor. We should still answer your question.
Any discussion on the motion before we take the vote? Right. I'll call for the vote.
Commissioner Bumbarger.
Aye.
Commissioner Casino.
Aye.
Commissioner Halverson.
Aye.
Commissioner Kaiser.
Aye.
Commissioner Nelson.
Nay.
Commissioner Fishburne.
Aye.
Commissioner Pessinger.
Aye.
Commissioner Bartlett.
Aye.
Vice Chair Hansen.
Aye. The motion passes. I would entertain the idea of creating am I empowered to just create a subcommittee? Okay, and
That's
then
the only one with authority.
I will create a subcommittee to draft a response to the staff report. And I would take volunteers that would like to be on that committee and do that on our behalf.
Sure.
Okay. Any other volunteers?
We need Daniel.
Yeah, I'm happy to help. I'm not gonna be primary author, but I'm happy to edit and such.
Okay, anyone else?
I have to play document checking through staff.
I can assist on this. I just got so much on my plate in the next 2 weeks, but I'll definitely chime in, but I intend to be there on the seventh, and I'll have a lot of comments to make. At least 4 minutes worth.
Well, so it's one of the work sessions, so they don't have the traditional public comment, but I think in the past, if planning commissioners have attended,
Right.
they're usually invited.
Yeah.
We do have a new county manager, so I just want to preface it with.
And I'll talk to him before that meeting.
Okay.
So you do need to consider then if there will be a quorum of planning commissioners there, if that needs to be noticed as a special meeting.
That's why I was asking who's gonna be present at that meeting, besides myself on the seventh.
Are we drafting a letter for the chair to sign?
No, direct to the BOCC.
Okay,
Just, it's to give context essentially.
so it's an addendum to.
It's basically just a report.
I think it can just be a letter.
And
As
I would-
long as you reference what the topic is and like the
Mhm.
docket item, so they can connect the two if it's coming in.
I would think it would be accurate to say that the subcommittee has been empowered by the planning commission to speak on their behalf, and that could be in the letter.
I would like that to be in the letter.
Barry, did you get your question answered?
No, who's gonna be there on the 7th?
Well, I think I would prefer to see it noticed no matter what, who's gonna be there, if for no other reason. If it's noticed, then we can show up. If not enough people show up, it doesn't really hurt anything, but it also lets the BOCC and the county managers know that this is a very hot topic for the planning commission.
I just want to point out, we found out today, the cost of our legal notices, I see Tasha's face over there, have increased exponentially. It would be great not to notice just in case. And when I say exponentially, $600 to $1,200 every time we post a legal notice now.
Are you talking about in the Olympian?
Oh,
That's the one, that's the notice you're talking about.
Legal notice.
Okay,
And
I didn't think that was required for a
Is
planning
that required
commission
for
meeting.
special? I'm looking to Tasha and Andrew. I am not the expert here.
Yeah, yes, it would be required because it's a special meeting.
So there is some latitude, I will say, regarding that. I know in the past, because it is important to do the legal noticing, we need to check in the logistics of if it's just as simple as posting on the door 24 hours in advance. But we've done a lot of special meetings, so we've done safer rather than not. And so we've been doing legal ads, but obviously, as Ashley mentioned, the costs have been going up. And so we can check in on that. It could potentially just be as simple as a notice goes on the door 24 hours in advance of a special meeting. But we'll know more by that point.
Or did you say it was, what time that day? 10 a.m.?
Like 10 to 11, I think.
It's, yeah, 10 to noon is the time block we get.
We don't know when within the actual conversation.
It's one of two items they have, so the
Yeah.
first item could be short or.
Yeah. So,
We all just hang out in the.
no one's gonna give me an answer about whether they're gonna be.
just gonna
on the
say,
ninth.
I'll
I
be
don't- I
there.
don't plan to be there.
I'm not there.
I will try to be there, but I'll be coming from out of town.
My mother, but I want to try to.
Yeah, okay, Daniel.
So the one other thing we can do, just to chime in real quick, is Tasha can send out kind of a poll a week or so prior before the event, so that we can just be sure as we get closer, because obviously it is a couple weeks away.
Yeah, and our official paper of record now only publishes once a week, so we will have to send out that poll to make sure if we do have to do it.
That's why I'm doing the poll now, to see if we're gonna have a majority of the planning commission present or not, and it doesn't look like we are.
So the Olympian is the only
No.
paper record, or?
No.
Our official paper of record now is Nisqually Valley News, but we are still posting in the Olympian for things that are of interest in North County.
I was gonna say, I've done legal notices through McClatchy for the Olympian, and it's not $600.
The Olympian, we just got quoted, what was it?
It was $1,200.
I guess
For a week or for 2 weeks?
One day.
One day,
1 day.
1 day legal notice
Gee.
for our,
Again,
yeah.
Our notices last month were like,
$100.
yeah,
But
Well, we
that's-
need to double check why ours are so expensive. Anyway,
I don't know if
It's not
McClatchy's is
necessarily your
giving you a
concern.
terrible rate, but it's worth double
Special
checking.
government fee.
We-
Right.
we are just all of a sudden a lot more cognizant of like, oh yeah.
I'm just curious because I very recently paid for public notices through McClatchy for the Olympian and the Tacoma News Tribune, and it was not that expensive.
Both of those came out under $200.
We will double check. We appreciate the insights.
Are we done with this agenda item?
I think we are.
Yes.
Okay,
So hold on, did
The-
Barry get the rest of his question answered?
Yeah, we're not gonna have a quorum, so I don't see a reason for notice.
Thank you.
I think it was time well spent, but we'll have to hustle through the rest of the agenda. So next on the agenda is work session number 18, Thurston 2045 on the climate element. And thank you, Amelia.
Thank you, Andrew.
Feel better.
Feel better.
Great. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I'll go ahead and share my screen here.
Sorry, I would open.
All right,
Question.
you should see
Question.
PowerPoint.
So
We can see it, yes.
it was asked who the consultant on this is, and it was mentioned Cascadia. I see that Kevin, who was also said that he was gonna be making presentations, is from Burke. Does it mean there's both are working on this, or there's multiple consultants?
So Burke is the consultant lead, and then Cascadia is one of their sub-consultants. So one team, but yes, different consulting agencies. And when we circle back to housing, you'll also probably hear from folks at Makers, which is another sub-consultant.
Thank you.
Okay. Hello, Planning Commission. Thank you for the opportunity to provide an update today on the climate element development process as part of the broader county comprehensive plan update. My name is Andrea Martin with Cascadia Consulting Group. I am Cascadia's Climate Action Director and one of the lead consultants supporting the climate element. I also have some other folks online with me tonight to support, and you'll hear from some of them, Megan Lee and Nicole Gutierrez with Cascadia Consulting and Kevin Gifford with Burke Consulting. Today, we'll provide a general update on the climate element, including a review of the objectives and approach for this element, preliminary findings from some of the foundational analyses that we've conducted, such as a policy audit, a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and climate vulnerability assessment that's underway. We'll also provide a summary of what we are hearing so far from our public and stakeholder engagement process, and we'll provide some sample policies that we're considering for inclusion in the element, and we'll conclude with next steps. First, I just want to provide a quick reminder on the context for this climate element. As some of you might recall, last year, Governor Inslee signed HB 1181 into law and added climate planning as an official goal of the Growth Management Act. It applies first to jurisdictions with 2025 comprehensive plan and periodic update due dates. The policy adds a greenhouse gas emission reduction sub-element that's mandatory for the state's 11 largest and fastest growing counties and their cities, and that includes Thurston County. The sub-element must include measures to reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions and per capita vehicle miles traveled. The law also adds a resilience sub-element that's mandatory for all fully planning jurisdictions. And that sub-element must include measures to mitigate natural hazards exacerbated by climate change and adapt to unavoidable impacts. To support development of this new element, the Washington Department of Commerce released intermediate guidance that includes a step-by-step guide for both resilience and greenhouse gas emission reduction sub-elements. It also includes a menu of measures that jurisdictions can use to consider and adapt as needed for their own climate elements. And it includes some additional tools as well, including a workbook that can be used to organize data and information related to the climate element and example analyses such as multi-criteria analyses for supporting policy assessment and prioritization. Given these requirements and the state's guidance, the planning team's goals for Thurston County's climate element are as follows. We aim to develop a climate element that is, of course, compliant with these new HB 1181 requirements, informed by data and community engagement. We are seeking to integrate this with other plans, including the mitigation and adaptation plans already on the books for Thurston County and other comp plan elements. We also are aiming to support the county in achieving its climate goals through this effort, including reducing greenhouse gas emissions and building resilience to climate change. We are aiming to develop an element that's supported by community members, county staff, and decision makers, and is clear, feasible, and provides a path to implementation. To support these goals, we laid out the following development process that's currently underway. We started with a policy and gap analysis and are currently conducting a climate vulnerability assessment. We are also wrapping up a comprehensive greenhouse gas emissions analysis, which included customization of an emission scenario planning model. And we also began some community and county staff engagement, including community meetings and county staff interviews. As these foundational analyses get finalized, we are now moving into the policy development phase of the planning process, in which we're starting to identify potential emission reduction and resilience policies. And then we will bring those draft policies to Planning Commission and the community and county staff over the coming months with a goal to have a draft element in the fall.
Can we take a pause for a question between slides?
Sure.
You got two bullets there, community and county staff engagement. What specifically on community engagement are you talking about?
Andrea, I can take this one if that would be helpful.
Sure. Yeah.
So whenever we've been going out to the community, we haven't just focused on one topic. And so we've been sure to ask questions about climate as well. So the open houses had content specific to climate. We've also been working with Rebecca Harvey, our climate mitigation program manager. And so she's been our connection point to folks like Thurston Climate Action Team, the Climate Advisory Work Group, which is a regional interjurisdictional work group specifically focused on climate mitigation. And then as it relates to resiliency, especially when you start thinking about our forestry and farm professionals, checking in with the Ag Advisory Committee, the Farm and Forestry Association, and things like that.
So what we're talking about is all the stuff that Miriam's going to or scheduled
All that.
county.
All that
For the-
sort of the
For the
general.
plan.
Yep, general plan, and then we have done targeted outreach when it pertains to a specific chapter, really asking those questions that we think, you know, might be most helpful to get feedback on from a learned experience perspective or a technical.
The reason I asked that question is because it's in this slide is being proposed or slide information is being discussed by our contractor. I wanted to know if the contractor was involved in that community engagement.
They have been. Yep, so they've helped prepare the materials and then we've had representatives from them attend virtually in some cases. Things like the Climate Advisory Work Group, Local Good Governance Coalition was another place that we did outreach to. So
Thank you. Appreciate it.
You mentioned that some chapters have had targeted outreach. Have we done targeted outreach events for this chapter?
it's targeted touch points, I would say.
No. Specifically for climate.
Well, open houses focus mostly on climate and housing, but we were open to feedback on a number of different items.
Commissioner Question.
So, sorry, just really quick. The thing is, we don't expect our community to know that our comprehensive plan is broken up into a dozen plus chapters. What we are really looking for is tell us what your vision is for this community. And then we as staff and as a planning commission, we can parse that out appropriately into the right place rather than putting that burden on the community to somehow figure out how comp plans are supposed to be put together and letting us know exactly where their comment fits in. Sorry, I just wanted.
I was just curious because you'd mentioned specifically targeting outreach events. If we'd done targeting this one.
We've done lots of outreach event. I would say it's targeted outreach to specific stakeholders. So
Gotcha.
Thurston Climate Action Team has a long history of engaging on this topic. Of course, we're gonna go and speak to them and get their feedback. And that's why I ran out even earlier and said like, hey, can we touch base with you just on the emergency response plan? So that's the kind of targeted outreach I was speaking of. If we know there's a group that's engaged in this, and we're always open to hear about groups that are engaged in stuff.
Sure. On slide 3, about the climate planning, new GMA goals under the topic of resilience, it was mentioned that's mandatory for all 11 jurisdictions. The phrase was used along the lines of that we need to plan to mitigate natural hazards that are due to climate change. What does that mean? What are some examples of those natural hazards? Would that include forest fires, sea level rise, extreme heat events, other things? Didn't see it further in the slides.
Yes, the resilience sub-element would touch on those types of climate impacts. And we're gonna touch on the climate vulnerability assessment later in the presentation, and we'll provide some further information on specific impacts that we're reviewing as part of that.
Ready to move on?
I have one further question. Regarding those impacts, I'm assuming that those impacts are focused on the human health and the like civic development, but as to Betsy's point earlier, they're probably not talking about ecosystem services or how they affect our species conservation or agricultural priorities.
We have definitely been raising that.
You have been raising.
Yeah, no, we're working with them. We have, that is at the forefront. I mean, our HCP is a long-term commitment. So that's one piece for sure. And then in addition to that, of course, anything related to salmon, and then our farm and forestry sectors. So
all of that is being considered under resilience specifically. Thank you.
Ashley, can you say if there's anything about the food security that Citizen Sepinen brought up this in her comments?
yeah, I mean, it'll probably play out more in the, I think the awareness is there, and it'll play out more in the policies, and then discussion about what those action items actually look like. And that's where we've been pulling in our agriculture program manager to get his feedback as well. Because he's in that, it's pretty close to that area that's gonna be seeing extreme heat, so.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're ready to move on.
Okay,
you,
great,
Andrea.
no problem. Feel free to interrupt if there's questions for sure. So first, I wanted to just provide an overview of the findings from our climate policy audit and gap analysis. We, as part of this, reviewed 15 key policy documents for this assessment. It included the current comprehensive plan, the climate adaptation strategy, the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan, hazard and flood mitigation plans, and the shoreline master program. We compiled all the policies and actions within those plans and tagged them by their focus areas. So whether they focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions or climate mitigation, or if they focus on enhancing resilience to climate impacts, or if they touched on topics such as environmental justice and equity, or if they're not directly or indirectly related to climate change. So those were all tagged and tallied. You can see the table summarizing the number of policies that we identified in each of those areas. And also acknowledging that climate change connects to a variety of sectors in the comprehensive planning process and space. So we also tagged the existing policies by relevant sectors that those policies touched on. So example, noting whether they focus on buildings and energy or transportation or ecosystems or water resources. This analysis revealed that Thurston County does have a good number of policies that address climate change, especially related to climate resilience. We also saw quite a few policies that touch on zoning and development, ecosystems, and transportation. I'll show you those results on the next slide in a moment. We identified some potential gaps where the county had relatively fewer policies, and that included climate equity, building energy, public health, and agriculture and food systems. So this table.
Oh, can we take a question quickly, Andrea?
Sure.
Thanks. On the previous slide, you said there's gaps in climate equity. Could you say more about what is meant by climate equity?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, this is any policy that gets at the acknowledgement that climate change will have disproportionate impacts on particular communities. And if the policy acknowledged that in some way or sought to address those inequities or disproportionate impacts explicitly, then we would note that as a climate equity focused policy.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you.
No problem. So here, this table shows the numbers that support those trends that I just mentioned. So you can see here that we identified over 200 policies addressing ecosystems, transportation, and zoning and development, but fewer policies related to buildings and energy, health and well-being, and agricultural and food systems. So our draft element policies will highlight those policy sectors that are already well supported by existing policy in Thurston County. And we'll also seek to introduce additional policy ideas for sectors that are currently less represented in current county policy. Any other questions related to this analysis before next I'll move into what we're hearing from engagement so far.
I just want to make sure I'm hearing you correctly about this. So in areas that do have a number of policies that already exist, there's still an acknowledgement that those policies may not be the right fit or a comprehensive fit. Those might still need to be tweaked or added to. I know that there's a prioritization that some of the stuff that's a little bit less addressed gets addressed, but I want to make sure that we're not like being like transportation's fine. We've got over 200 policies that relate to transportation. It's probably good.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We are going through and we have a big database that has all these policies noted, and for each of the policies noting if we have recommendations for potential amendments or revisions to those policies to make sure that they're supporting this climate change element objectives to the extent possible. So in some cases, you know, if there's good coverage, we'll say that one looks good, no change. But in other cases where we think that policy could be strengthened to make sure it's addressing climate change appropriately, we are noting that recommended change.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yes.
Just a
Commissioner
comment
Kaiser.
that there's a qualitative issue here and a quantitative issue, and just because we have a big number up there doesn't mean it's quality. So we're of course going to be looking at the quality of the policy as well as the numbers of policy.
Those 29 waste management policies are really good.
Oh.
Nailed it.
Some of these issues are just inherently less complex.
Yeah.
Don't require 300
That
policies.
number surprised me.
Well, and a lot of times more actions means there's a larger need there to take actions.
I am glad to see that there's the most policies for zoning design.
Yeah.
That was sarcasm.
Thank you, Andrea.
No problem. Yeah, and I'll review in a moment some of the findings from our greenhouse gas emissions inventory, which can hit at some of the points that you just made in terms of where might be areas of more or less focus based on where your emissions are coming from. So you'll hear about that later in the presentation. So next I'll provide an overview of what we've heard so far in the engagement with the community around climate change issues and policy considerations. So as we mentioned that we did some community engagement. This slide provides an overview of some of that community engagement that's been conducted to date. It's included outreach at existing events as well as focused summits held in different locations across the county. These in-person outreach events were also complemented with focus groups with county staff, email and social media updates, and ongoing open public comment opportunities. So here's what we are starting to hear from the community based on this outreach so far. These are some of the themes from the engagement that we've heard. Related to greenhouse gas emission reductions, we have heard an interest in carbon sequestration initiatives. So that would be pulling carbon from the atmosphere and sequestering it into trees, for example, or soils. We have also heard an interest in increasing urban housing development to reduce vehicle miles traveled, increase opportunities for economic development initiatives. So looking at opportunities to enhance green jobs, community solar, and with a special focus on low income communities and supporting low income communities with these economic development opportunities. And we've also heard an interest in incentives and making sure there are incentives available and prioritizing that over mandates. Related to climate resilience, we have heard an interest in increase for planning for climate change impacts on natural resources specifically. I think that's already come up a little bit in the conversation so far. an interest in updating emergency management plans to make sure it can support sustainable recovery post-disaster, and enhancing building codes and providing incentives for renewable energy installations to ensure continuity during emergency events.
Good
Any
question.
questions? Yeah.
Some of the feedback we heard today from public comment was particularly focused on vehicle miles traveled, and basically pointing out that not all vehicle miles traveled are the same. Commercial vehicles versus private passenger vehicles are not the same in their consumption or the impacts they have on the climate. Is that on your radar as well, or are we treating, you know, the miles in someone's 10-year-old Nissan Leaf the same as you know, mega trucker hauling coal across something? I don't know. I just want to know, like, I'm trying to make the most extreme comparison there. Yeah. So like, is there a distinction in your study, or is that something you guys are looking at?
Yeah, it is. So the greenhouse gas inventory, I don't have a slide that shows that distinction, but I'm happy to speak to it. We look at passenger vehicles as a separate category from freight and commercial vehicles. So we're able to understand how the VMT, vehicle miles traveled, varies between those two types of vehicles and what those implications are in terms of emissions. So we are looking at those separately. Yep.
And I guess my other question is, the roads aren't the only place where goods and services travel in our county. Are you looking specifically only at miles on the road, or are we considering use of trains and the port in this too?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the greenhouse gas inventory does take into consideration emissions from marine and rail transportation. So that includes the port related activity. And what was the other example you mentioned?
Airport.
Yeah, we have an
Yep.
airport.
Yep. It also includes air
Absolutely.
travel. Yeah, so it includes any emissions from local airports, as well as any estimated emissions from residents of Thurston County traveling in and out of SeaTac.
What do we do about I-5?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because vehicle miles traveled, to be clear here, this is the other aspect of vehicle mile travel, and I know that's not your only metric here, but it's one of the weaknesses of it is that you can only be going 5 miles, but if you're going 5 miles and you're idling for like 3 hours while you're doing that, it's not the same emissions as if you are just traveling straight through. So if we're looking at congestion, I think that part of your development solution here might address this, but if we're talking about congestion, if we're talking about the gridlock around I-5, that little bottleneck, I think that's going to be really substantive here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know there is a more detailed VMT analysis that's being done as part of the comprehensive plan update that we are going to be looking at and collaborating on, that I think will look into some of these more specific issues. For the greenhouse gas emissions component, you know, unfortunately the data we have available currently is a higher level where it's just estimating total vehicle miles traveled, and it uses their modeling based on traffic counts and things to estimate the speeds that those vehicles are traveling. And from that, we estimate the emissions associated with that travel. So.
And so just really quick, Andrea, I just want to let this group know that we're not the only ones looking at this. And I don't think that we necessarily want our comp plan to be the source of all information related to GHG emissions reductions or VMT. This is really a regional effort. And so a lot of this work is being done in parallel or being done at that more granular level by the team that's been working on the climate mitigation plan. So that interjurisdictional work group. So there's some stuff that's going to be done in our comp plan or that we have resources to be able to carry out. And then I think there's broader regional efforts to fund and get down to that more granular level.
I'm happy that it's being handled in such a systemic way. I just think that if we're going to be, where we're counting on that information, it should be referenced that we are and where to find that. That's all I'd ask there. I'm not asking you guys to duplicate a bunch of effort.
Sheila forgot.
Or maybe that it might not be done by us, because we don't necessarily have the resources.
Sure, Casino.
On the climate resilience part, the last bullet point of enhance building codes and provide incentive for renewable energy installations to ensure business continuity during emergencies. I guess my question would be, what is an emergency? How long does that last? Is that something that's, you know, for a week, or is that something that's for a decade? And is this something other than just putting solar panels on places so we could turn the lights on during that week, or? We're talking.
I was gonna make a comment that energy storage would probably need to be included in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this would probably be more short term, where there were disruptions from, you know, an event that where if you had rooftop solar with battery storage, as you mentioned, it could help, you know, kind of keep the lights on and keep business running, you know, for up to a week or something like that. But
in that vein, I would wonder how we would prioritize the most critical facilities.
And vulnerable populations.
Yeah.
Hospitals, senior centers, places where people are more likely to. And jobs.
So go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm curious, this slide's talking about what you're hearing from the public. The pursuing greenhouse gas reduction incentives over mandates, is that a across the board thing? Is that an opinion coming from a particular group? I know in my experience, that is not a universal opinion. Business interests tend to dislike mandates. People with large estates tend to dislike mandates. Poor folks who rely on public transit and largely rent their homes and stuff tend to have less resistance to mandates and sometimes even be in favor of them. I'm just curious how that feedback's breaking down across who you're hearing from.
yeah, I would say it's definitely a theme that we have heard across different outreach points. I can't remember specifically, you know, which of them we heard them from. I don't know if Amelia or others have any insight just based on the other events that you might have attended.
I think we generally hear, like at our open houses and whatnot, that incentives are more welcome than additional regulation.
In general, or in this context specifically? I ask this because this is an issue where the people who have the most resources are the most insulated from the risks here, and the people who have fewer resources tend to be much more open to, or are going to be much more vulnerable. The people who are going to be, who would be open to the incentives are the people who aren't going to be affected, and the people who would be most affected are the people who would be least affected by a mandate.
So I'll stick with the general term only because if you think about the open houses we've had and the outreach we've done, we haven't shared any specifics. So if I think about the questions that we've asked or the conversations we've had, they have been very generalized. And I'd say in a lot of situations, I haven't used terms like greenhouse gas reduction because it might not even be a welcome term to use. And so we've really been trying to talk about it just in general about how folks in their lived experience, how this is impacting them or not. So when there are more specifics, I think I could give you more specific feedback on like who is saying, no, I don't want to be told to do that versus, yes, we'd be welcoming that. And I'm sorry, I'm pausing because I'm trying to play out even what the mandate would look like versus the incentive.
I mean, we're always talking about shoulds and musts, or shoulds versus musts, and I think this is one of those areas where it's like, are we encouraging people to do something, or are we trying to insist that standards be met?
I'd also, a topic that is frequently brought to us by staff is a lack of resources. Incentives cost resources. If it's presented in a it would be great if we had the resources to provide incentives, but if we can't do that and our other option is mandates, which would you prefer? Do nothing, do mandates, or have sort of unenticing incentives because we lack the resources to really make an incentive attractive? I think there's nuance there that can easily be missed. Particularly from vulnerable folks who might not necessarily have the ear of volunteers in some of these events because of who they cater to, where they are, and who comes to them.
Especially who comes to them.
Commissioner Pisher.
Yeah, I agree with all these concerns. In this particular case, I read this as maybe attached to a slight degree to the bullet point above, and an example would be incentives for installing solar as opposed to mandates to install solar. But point taken on, we ought to be careful about all these things and who they impact the most.
I know I'm talking a lot, this is probably driving everyone crazy, but we're talking about climate resilience, is there any discussion? This seems very focused on energy use and emergencies. I'm concerned about water use. Cisterns in high-risk areas for fire, or, energy is the major concern right now, but this is the 2045 plan. If we're in extended droughts, water could be a real concern. And I'm just wondering if that's also being looked at under climate resilience.
It is definitely being looked at. We have our water hazards and climate resiliency team is not only looking at it at that high level, but we are looking at all the data we've been collecting for the last 30 years to try to create models to project out.
To get through that section.
Yeah.
This PowerPoint.
Yeah, I'll keep this brief because I know we're trying to get to the next thing. We're talking about business continuity during emergencies and that one, and in the incentives for renewable energy. Presumably, we're talking that's around the context of, like you were saying, basically like making sure there are solar powered areas where businesses can keep their lights on and stuff. I have mostly been working during climate emergencies that we have had with underhouse folks and protecting themselves from needing protection from wind and from heat. And I would encourage us to include that when we're talking about renewable energy installations, is these sort of larger resiliency hubs, making maybe incentives for communities to be able to provide, or businesses or other entities to be able to provide those reliably in the areas where people are actually living that are vulnerable, so that people can get access to those during emergencies. I worry, as a business owner, I worry less about business continuity than human life continuity. And that's usually what's at stake there.
Cooling centers.
Cooling centers, wind shelters, places that people can get in who live in vulnerable housing, places that people can go to get out of that.
Warming centers.
Yep.
Maybe I'm wrong on this, but I seem to remember reading somewhere that the number of times that somebody is killed by heat compared to the number of times somebody's killed by cold is much less. A lot more people freeze to death than burn up or heat stroke out or anything like that. And that if we're worried about the global warming aspect of climate change, maybe we need to, our focus needs to be shifted the other direction a little bit more when we worry about some of these kind of things. And I don't know how you're going to use a renewable resource to keep people warm in the winter.
I think it's directly related to that. We're talking about making sure that energy reserves in general are being preserved, and renewable resources that would provide you. This comes back to the storage question that we've discussed a few times, but we're going to need to talk about energy storage through the winter when we have especially a high demand of it, and that's going to be related to renewable.
I know Commissioner Hansen does this for a living, so you might be a little bit more of an SME on this than anybody else. Is there long-term energy storage that would go from season to season?
Hydrogen.
And how long is that away? 10 years?
No, it's coming in the next year.
Built in Tacoma right now.
Yeah,
It's viable now.
Lewis County Transit has taken possession of the first 3 hydrogen buses in all of the Northwest. And they are driving them today, and they are designing a facility to produce their own hydrogen that they hope will be online in just a few years.
Also hydro.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's our plans for a very large hydrogen production facility at TransAlta with Fortescue Future Industries. the outfit out of Western Australia.
We discussed previously the use of reservoirs as batteries as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Which would be, if anything, more
Yep,
available.
pump
than
hydro
normal.
or, you know, water storage.
Water.
Yeah.
Storage.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
very old school and it's still pretty
I
efficient.
particularly love the energy storage where you use excess energy when you don't need it to stack cement blocks.
Oh, yeah,
That's
the
right.
train cars.
And then lower them when you need the energy. It's just so elegant in my opinion.
A lot of our carbon intensive energy infrastructure is backup energy infrastructure that kicks on during high demand. So we really do help reduce greenhouse gas emissions when we balance that.
Just want to make sure that we
Oh.
get through the presentation. Not
Yeah,
that this
yeah, yeah.
isn't good stuff,
One-
but
One comment I would
taking
have about
notes.
this slide that, just to echo, the comment from Loretta Sepinen. I know that in my mind, natural resources encompasses agriculture and in turn food security, but maybe those could be, things that we look to call out specifically.
I think it was worth calling them out separately because they kind of work in different directions sometimes.
Good point.
Yeah.
On Daniel's behalf, I'll comment about the icon. Put a cloud above the plant, not beneath it, otherwise people might confuse it for chocolate sugar.
And
Noted.
with that, Andrea, thank you very much.
Work on those icons. All right, so I'm actually going to hand it over to my colleague Megan to talk through the vulnerability assessment and resilience sub-element. And I think I'll definitely tie into some of the things that you've already started discussing. So go ahead, Megan.
Great, thanks, Andrea. And we can go on to the next slide, please. So just as a quick overview, I know we went through this in the first Planning Commission meeting that we attended, but just as a reminder, our vulnerability framework evaluates 3 key factors. So how much a resource and or community is exposed to climate impacts, how sensitive it is to those impacts, and then some indication of the adaptive capacity or the actions and conditions that help prepare for climate impacts, which can overall decrease vulnerability. So simply put, vulnerability is the degree to which natural, built, and human systems are at risk of exposure to climate change impacts. And this formula helps us quantify overall vulnerability and helps guide our assessment for the county. Can move on to the next slide, please. Great, so this should also look familiar. We shared this during the first meeting, but our first step for creating the vulnerability assessment is to understand the current and anticipated climate impacts within the county. And so this is something we've already done. I know there's a question earlier about what climate impacts were assessed. So we assessed temperature, precipitation, wildfire smoke, stream flow, and then sea level rise. So just as context there. We leveraged the climate impacts group climate mapping for a resilient Washington. I know it's kind of a mouthful, but that web tool to establish a baseline understanding of the anticipated climate impacts across the different sectors in Thurston County, which I'll get to in the next slide. And then we complemented the climate impact groups map with other downscaled and localized data sets to gain a full picture of the climate impacts affecting Thurston County. We're also in the process of conducting a document review of relevant documents such as the comprehensive plan, the hazard mitigation plan, and adaptation plan. So this process enables us to identify and document critical climate hazards, impacts, and assets, while also assessing the extent to which current policies support resilience efforts. So this will really help highlight where current planning gaps are in terms of those priority hazards and assets. And so these were the policies that were that kind of Andrea spoke to earlier in the policy audit, but we're also using them to inform our vulnerability assessment. As Andrea mentioned, we've conducted multiple interviews with staff folks from different departments to ensure a well-rounded understanding of climate exposure sensitivity and adaptive capacity within the county. So kind of filling in gaps where we weren't able to glean information from documents and supplementing that with interviews from staff. We can move on to the next slide, please. Great. So we have 5 different focus areas for this vulnerability assessment: human well-being and emergency management, ecosystems and water resources. And then I'm not going to go over all the subtopics because it's on the slide here, but we also have infrastructure, community design, land use and economic development, and then natural resource lands and rural economy. So I know earlier there was a comment about what if agriculture and food systems was included in kind of the resilient sub-element. And so yes, it is under natural resource lands and rural economy. So just wanting to point that out.
One of the areas that was pointed out was wildlife habitat. You don't see that on here at all.
I think that's probably what they mean by critical areas, but I want a clarification on that.
Yep, that's what, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's absolutely right. It would be helpful to see that amplified.
I would also want to go beyond that. We're talking about, when we talk about critical areas, we end up talking about islands of habitat that are particularly important, that are ultimately irrelevant if in a climate change context, if ecosystems and individuals can't move between critical areas. So I'd like to see critical areas and connectivity specifically in the context of species preservation be a focus. I may be revisiting that later, but in the interest of making sure that we can continue with this, I just wanted to say that right now.
We talked about corridors a lot at the last meeting.
Yeah.
Commissioner Fisher.
Yeah, also for clarification, did I hear you say that food security was rolled into the natural resource lands and rural economy piece?
We were more focusing on agriculture in that section, but we can touch on food security, which is usually kind of in like human well-being. So public health, that section.
Yeah, it would have made more sense to me to see, I guess, in the human well-being piece, but.
Thank you.
Yeah, food access and like food systems is in the public health, kind of a subset of that, of public health, and then agriculture is within the natural resource lands and rural economy.
Thank you, Megan.
So, all right, I think we can continue on. Oh, great, thanks. Okay, so yeah, we're assessing 3 components for this vulnerability assessment. One is social and economic vulnerability, so evaluating community and economic vulnerabilities, and then also physical vulnerability, so how infrastructure and natural systems like parks and transit, transportation systems are impacted. And then also understanding the compounding and cascading impacts, so understanding how multiple climate hazards and socioeconomic stressors interact and deepen social inequities. So just wanting to kind of point that out. This slide shows kind of how we're assessing vulnerability for different focus areas. So at the block group level, we're assessing vulnerability for human well-being and emergency management. And then we're doing a spatial analysis of vulnerability for ecosystems and water resources, infrastructure, and then natural resource lands and rural livelihoods. And then a qualitative research assessment, which I kind of mentioned earlier with our document review for all the focus areas. So that's what's depicted here. I'm gonna hand it off to, I'm not sure if this slide is on the slide deck you're showing, Andrea, but can you just advance to the next slide really quickly? I want to see if it's, okay, so the slide that we had for Kevin to speak about the indicators didn't make it into this version of the slide deck, but Kevin, if it's okay, I'm gonna hand it off to you now to just talk about those indicators.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, Andrew, would you mind just going back one slide to the methodology diagram? Thank you.
Feel free to share your screen if you'd like, Kevin.
I think I can speak to this pretty quickly. I realize we're kind of on a tight timeline, but if there are follow-up questions, I can potentially share some maps or documents in response to those. But yeah, good evening, commissioners. My name is Kevin Gifford. I'm at Burke Consulting. I've been working with the Cascadia Group specifically on the climate vulnerability assessment and the spatial analysis component of that. As Megan alluded to earlier in the presentation, we're kind of looking at this in sort of 3 general buckets that combine to look at vulnerability, specifically exposure, measuring sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And so for each of those buckets, we've developed a list of indicators that kind of tie in with the topic areas that have been shown to you on the previous slide. So again, exposure, we're measuring things like heat, flooding and precipitation, air quality, fire risk. For sensitivity, these are things looking at like, the age of the population, chronic health conditions that are present in the local population, things of that nature. And then adaptive capacity are the things that reflect their ability to respond to climate crisis, such as their socioeconomic conditions, housing condition, employment, transportation infrastructure, things of that nature. So from a spatial standpoint, we really want to take a look at essentially how different parts of the county score, for lack of a better term. Like, how do they perform on each of these different metrics? And so we've compiled a list of individual indicators for each of those groups. And it's quite a few for, anywhere between, depending on the area, it's between, 10 to 16 indicators for each of those groups. And essentially they, each measure different aspects of exposure, sensitivity, or adaptive capacity. And we basically have compiled and standardized the data sets at the census block group levels so that we can have a standard unit of measurement for comparing all of these things. And then also this is convenient because it allows us to pull demographic information from the Census Bureau and pull that into our analysis as well. And so essentially we're evaluating each of those indicators at that scale, and then we combine them and standardize them so that essentially we can generate a score for each of those topic areas that says, how does this census block group perform relative to every other census block group in the county? That way you can essentially see the areas where you have relatively higher or lower exposure or sensitivity or adaptive capacity. And so then essentially from that point, you can then start to narrow in. Oh, yes. Thank you, Drew. Appreciate you putting that up there. So this is the list right here of some of the indicators that we have been using for this analysis. And so essentially the idea is being that we need to measure, we have something measurable here that we can hang this on. And so as you can see, there's, kind of the ranges from extreme heat to air quality and things of that nature for exposure, and then sensitivity. A lot of this information is pulled from Census Bureau or from the CDC, which tracks a lot of these chronic health conditions and their prevalence in the population. And then the adaptive capacity is pulled from similar sources as well. And so these indicators are then combined into sort of a score that we can compare across the county. And this essentially allows us to look at very specific locations and identify then like, okay, this area has a particularly high exposure. How does the sensitivity rank in that area? And then we can essentially compute what is the overall vulnerability there so that we can then, this facilitates the very focused topic discussions that Megan was alluding to, looking at specific infrastructure issues and natural resource issues, and looking and inform the policy analysis to essentially narrow down that search. This also allows us, if there are specific factors that are of interest to you or to the community, we can then map these factors against each other. So that if you're wanting to isolate areas specifically, just to use some examples that are on the screen here, if you wanted to isolate areas that score particularly high with a very high population of folks over 65 who might therefore be very vulnerable to extreme weather events, you could then cross map that with areas that are have high exposure scores for extreme heat or extreme precipitation or wildfire danger. And that would be able to let you kind of narrow in and see what parts of the county are going to be likely to be most vulnerable to those particular risks.
Kevin, we have a question real quick.
Absolutely.
On these different metrics, they're not weighted the same, are they?
We can weight them in a number of different ways. One of the things that, in terms of how we kind of set this list to begin with, one of the things we're trying to be very careful about is not sort of overemphasizing any particular topic area. And so, but there are things that, we can change the weights of essentially how these are calculated, because the indicator, we compute a score for every individual indicator, and then those are combined by topic area to kind of create a sub-index. And that calculation, and again, that's a policy priority decision that the county wants to make, to say, well, we're most concerned about this particular topic area. That's a weighting that we can adjust in terms of the vulnerability model.
So is your baseline map with them equally weighted?
The sort of our initial analysis weights the indicators equally, yes.
If I could just bring up again, these are all entirely human focused, with the exception of the wildland urban interface, which again is focusing just where people meet the edge of wildlands. Humans don't live on planets without animals and insects. Like we can't go it alone, and part of climate resiliency is those animal populations. So I just want to reiterate that again.
I see it elsewhere, but I would be interested to see how it's being weighted when we're talking about the vulnerability.
What's PM?
It's a
Particles per
particulate
million.
matter.
Or is it
So the two, I can't remember the specific, but it's particulate matter. It's fine particulate matter in the air. So, yeah. Thank you, Kevin.
Absolutely. Yeah, and yes, we appreciate the feedback in terms of the list of indicators. I think one of the things, this is, you know, we kind of built this initial list of indicators based off of sort of what is prevalent, commonly assessed, what we see in the literature about climate resilience planning and similar climate index work that's been done in other places, in other jurisdictions. But at the same time, we are certainly open to, you know, other priorities and other things that you would like us to include, and we can look at how we can incorporate those as well. And did I see another question?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, so just one more thing in terms of context of risk. I know that you do address it later, and if you want to address it then that's fine, where you talk about working with communities and tribes around cultural resources. One of the risks that we're dealing with climate change is the First Nations that are within our counties access to their treaty rights and cultural resources that are very climate vulnerable. And that a lot of people do depend on for their survival. I'm wondering how those because those are so culturally significant and tied to a historical climate pattern. I'm wondering how those would be scored within this, whether they are something that would be within what you already have there, whether that needs to be a separate category. Just a thought I wanted to put out for the climate indicators.
Commissioner Pestinger.
I'm glad that the sensitivity list doesn't include difficult to work for bosses, or I might be listed up there. But I'm curious, I see a lot of things that'll kill you. I don't see cancer, and there's a lot of forms of cancer, and there's quite a bit of location-based cancers. You would think that something designating risk factors at a census block level would look for cancers that are often tied to local water sources, local dumping grounds, local formerly toxic waste sites, local other factors. Any reason why cancer is not included?
I think right off the top of my head, I can't give you an exact answer on why that was not on the list. I'd have to check our notes from our screening process. I think because a lot of the information is pulled from CDC data, and I think I would just have to check on the availability of that information, of whether that was one of the challenges that we have when putting an index like this together. And I think I can also respond to the previous question with this as well, that the index, the process is we have to have sort of reliable, standardized data across the entire area that we're surveying. And so unfortunately, that does make it difficult to incorporate things that are not potentially captured by different agencies that are compiling the data. So for instance, the cultural resources question that was posed, those are obviously incredibly important and should be considered in a vulnerability analysis. But I think one of the things is we don't have hard data on that to be able to incorporate it into the index itself. However, as Megan kind of laid out when she was starting to kind of show that diagram earlier, was that the spatial aspect of this really is there to sort of highlight areas of high vulnerability, and then that lens can be applied to the discussion of specific policy topics. And so the idea of being able to say that, well, okay, if we know that there are specific populations in the county with cultural resource concerns that we need to address, we can look at the vulnerability that is associated with the areas where they live, and then apply that to a policy discussion, even if that is not directly incorporated into the index in a quantitative way. So again, that's one of the challenges of trying to, unfortunately, we cannot quantify everything. That would make some of this analysis a little bit easier, but this is here to help guide those qualitative policy discussions. Yeah,
I would just say to put a fine point on that. This is really a resource for the Planning Commission, just one. We obviously know, living here in Thurston County, that cultural resources include our prairies, all of our salmon bearing waterways. And those are things that we'll be exploring policies for in the new climate element, regardless of whether they're included in this model. So I just want to make sure that like we can keep all these ideas without running multiple iterations of a model, which I'm not sure is going to tell us a lot different than what we already know on the ground.
Just quickly, it sounds like you're producing sub-scores for each of these, and I think as a tool, the aggregate is helpful, but it might also be useful to be able to just look at exposure, just look at sensitivity, just look at adaptive capacity, since that is data that it sounds like you're already producing. If and when those resources become available to us, it would be great to be able to compare, like that really dark area near Grand Mound would be really curious to see like what is driving that. Is it all three? Is it just one? Particularly with some of the large construction projects.
Right. Yes, absolutely. That data, that information will be available in the final version of all of this, because you're correct. In order to compute that final aggregate score, we have to compute all of these individual scores first. And so, and just to kind of clarify, were you referring to the extreme heat map that was presented earlier in the slide deck when you mentioned?
There's been some discussion about distribution centers being built on rural industrial land, and that's building giant heat islands in an area that looks like it's about to be prone to extreme heat. So that's all I was thinking about.
Yes, yes. And so I think that is an example of one of the single indicator maps that we can produce. So essentially we can produce a map just like that for every single indicator on this list, if you wanted, and then be able to do it again by, as you suggested, by sub-score, and then also by the kind of the overall vulnerability score as well. And so that way you can see kind of how each area sort of varies in each of these different areas. And then again, as I mentioned, if there are multiple factors that you want to see combined specifically, that's also something that the tool can accommodate.
My question probably for Ashley, remember we talked multiple times in the past about some risk mapping and vulnerable risk neighborhoods and things like that. That was a state data, or was that some other form of data? That's not this. This is separate from that entirely, or this is related to
I think this would be, as far as I can recall, this would be related to that, because our climate element grant includes a vulnerability risk assessment.
Okay, this is that. Thank you.
And we didn't, I mean, at least from a staff perspective, most of the stuff hasn't been surprising. It's like, we know Grand Mountain Rochester is at risk. Nisqually is another area. And that's where we've been hearing from folks, so I think what this does is verify a lot of the lived experience feedback we've received, which is good. You've got both qualitative and quantitative.
Thank you, Kevin.
Absolutely. So I guess just, I think that basically we've kind of covered between looking at this slide and then the questions from the commissioners, they've covered everything that I had intended to speak to before handing it back to Megan. But are there any other questions specifically about how the index will be computed, or any other concerns about that, or about specific indicators that you feel are missing from this list?
Almost overwhelmed by that last question.
Yeah. Well, and which ones would be helpful for future decisions? Because as anyone knows that's involved in sort of model building, you can run so many different computations. So really focusing on the ones that you think would be helpful in policy discussions, so that, yeah, rather than just because it'd be interesting to see.
We should have ACS data we can pull for people who speak a language other than English and their primary residents. Those people in particular tend to be more vulnerable and need a higher level. Well, that people who speak a language other than English primarily at home is the statistic that ACS grabs, but that's available at the census tract level. And I think it is important for us to think about when we think about adaptive capacity. If there's an area that has a particularly large minority population that, for instance, in Thurston County speaks Vietnamese, it would be helpful for planning in that area to include communication Vietnamese. And so they're more vulnerable and it requires more attention for us. So I think that might be useful to have in our adaptive capacity. and it's data I know that already exists, already formatted to the census tracts.
We use it.
Yeah.
That's covered by linguistic isolation on the adaptive capacity list.
I missed that. That's all on me.
Nope, no problem. There was a lot of text up there.
If you could put the text back up, that'd be helpful. For things that we would look for as a possible addition, I noticed, we look at things about heat islands and we look at urban wildland interface. Those are good, but I'm surprised there's nothing on there about where you usually hear about health issues associated with locales is things like proximity to industrial area or proximity to living right next to a freeway or proximity to a former toxic waste site. I know we don't have them all over the county, but there's some pretty bad stuff in Bud Bay. Former sites of creosote running, making telephone poles and all those kinds of things that operated for 100 years and then just got pushed underwater. Being proximate to some of those has pretty clear health impacts.
And that should be straightforward to map.
Yeah.
And have historical data associated with it.
So I would encourage those types of additions.
I also think that a lot of this is going to live and die in how stuff is weighted. I want to reinforce what Commissioner Casino referenced in that regard.
Weighting matters.
Weighting matters.
Oh, yeah, weighting matters, yeah.
And so that's going to be something that we're going to want to talk about pretty significantly later on.
Are these indicators not in the PowerPoint that we got in the?
They're not.
I was gonna say.
We can send it out as
If we have any, I don't want to spend more time on this. I think we're doing that because there's a big list and we recognize the priority of this. If we have anything else that we want to add to this in the next immediate short time period, will we have that ability? And what would that time frame look like?
We have another session on climate element on August
Oh, we've got
21st.
multiple climate. I mean, I think it's really good. It's really good to have these sort of early discussions to help guide what comes to the planning commission next.
Have I missed life expectancy on there or is that somewhere on there? Cause I think that's a really good meta indicator. If people in a particular census tract live longer, that's a good indicator that their
It
environmental.
looks like there's a bunch of things that would predict life expectancy, but nothing that just uses life expectancy, probably because that's pretty high level.
Yeah. It's just curious. Might be useful as a separate overlay. Compare the two.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you. I'll hand it back to Megan.
Great, thanks. And I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and then hand it back to Andrea. If you could go ahead and share your screen, that'd be great. Awesome. Cool. So I just wanted to quickly go over some focus areas and strategies that will be included in the resilience sub-element and then quickly walk through some example actions. I'm not going to read through all of them just because I know we're trying to get to the greenhouse gas stuff as well. But just high level, we have 5 different focus areas. So we have built environment, water resource management, community well-being, and emergency services. And then on the next slide, we have some other focus areas. But for built environment, an example action that would be included in the resilience sub-element could be conducting an environmental justice audit prior to rezoning or new zoning designations. For water resource management, an example action included in the sub-element could be encouraging sustainable water management through incentives or requiring use of green infrastructure. And then for community well-being and emergency management, an example action could be promoting the use of health impacts assessments and then developing community resilience hubs that I know was mentioned earlier. We can go to the next slide, Andrea. So then some more focus areas and strategies. We have cultural resources and practices. So an example action here could be protecting, restoring, and enhancing ecosystems that meet treaty rights, and then maintaining government-to-government relations with tribes. We also have ecosystems as a focus area. So example actions here could be ensuring no net loss of ecosystems and then developing a tree canopy ordinance. We have agriculture and food systems. So example actions could be expanding regenerative agriculture, and then supporting expansion of local food security. And then lastly, we have economic development, so seeking opportunities to facilitate green jobs, and then supporting the climate preparedness of local businesses. Oh yeah, I think I see a hand up.
Yeah, I have, regarding the ecosystem section, I know we're gonna be getting into a lot of this later. I just wanted to say, if we do have, it sounds like you guys are still in the stage where we're gathering a lot of information. If we do have some interesting additional supplemental information for any one part of this, how would be the best way to get it to you? I have a lot of ecosystem analysis specifically around that idea of corridors and habitat protection that has been pretty well produced, and I think it would be relevant to this discussion. And I'm wondering how I can get that to you.
Amelia, yeah.
Okay, I will do that right now.
Our lead on our team, and then she can make sure it's distributed to the whole consultant team.
Thank you.
Follow on
Go,
point to
Commissioner
that
Pestro.
ecosystems topic, I just would beg us to not use ensure no net loss as an example action.
Yeah.
I think it's literally the worst policy that's ever been invented. It's like,
what does it mean?
I mean, it might mean something if we actually measured it, if we actually tracked that, how much. It seems to be just an open door to, oh, no net loss. That means we can swap lots of things. We can get losses here and there and there, as long as we make it up for it somewhere at some point. And we never track it, and we never go up. We have no enforcement on it. So I just feel like we ought to say something that's actually clear, reasonable, and accomplishable.
We are starting to, this is a big improvement, I think. We are starting to track agricultural activities, great baselines as part of the voluntary stewardship program, and we will hopefully be able to bring you a draft of the tree canopy assessment as well here in the coming months, which would establish the baseline for that too. So we are making an effort, but to your point, a lot of it's grant funded work, and it's like, if we don't get the grant money, we don't necessarily get an opportunity to update and assess how we're doing.
And also, while I love that, and I hope we get that info as soon as possible, like, it's literally been a policy of no net loss for how many years? Like 30 plus? And can you tell me how we've measured if we've had no net loss in the last 30 years?
No net loss of ecological systems?
Yeah.
Has been a policy of the county for 30 years?
I'm asking, it's been a long time. I think 30 plus years.
I
don't think so.
I don't,
I think it's tied to probably
think-
critical areas update.
Shorelines.
That's as far
yeah, we
as
have
I
it for
know.
shoreline, but I don't think we have it for ecosystems at large.
No?
I think it's definitely gonna come up in the implementation plan, sort of the how we do it versus just having an intention of doing it.
With shorelines, we went through and did a whole inventory. I don't know how you could even start considering a no net loss policy without having an inventory in place first, which I know is exactly what you're asking, but that's also why I don't think that there is one outside of shorelines and other critical areas.
I think the
Farmland
policy
has
has been there, whether it has been. Yeah, whether those inventories have been done and regular assessments have been done, I think it's the follow through, it's the action.
Yeah, paper exists with the words.
Doesn't
And without a lot of like, what is it? Like, I know it exists in chapter 3 for ag, and it's like, well, no net loss of what is your baseline?
Yeah.
And when I was the first ag program manager, that was one of the first questions I asked, like, so what are we measuring?
Yeah.
So good point. Hold on to that when you start getting to things like implementation plan, and ask us those difficult questions of like, so how are you doing this, and where are the resources coming from to do it consistently? So.
We're just looking at square footage and they're not connected to each other. It's kind of useless as habitat.
Okay, thank you, Megan.
Great. Okay, so we have one last slide, and actually we're going to keep these questions towards the end, but I'll just go over them quickly because we'll get to them once Nicole goes through the. Oh, Andrea, were you going to say something?
I was just gonna say, I think we've engaged in a lot of discussion along the way, so if there's input on these questions, I think that's fine.
Okay, so yeah, if there's just any considerations around climate change impacts that we should keep in mind, and then any key opportunities to build resilience, and then how these opportunities vary across the county. So those are two questions we have. There was also one question that Kevin kind of posed earlier about the indices. Are there any concerns about the list of indices? I know we kind of walked through that, but just wanting to also mention that here if there's anything else on the indicators that we want to discuss.
Yes, specifically around key opportunities, I think that a lot of these different things end up intersecting right around Nisqually, right around the bridge, and the opportunities that exist around rebuilding that when we're talking about habitat connectivity, when we're talking about climate resilience, both ecologically and agriculturally, when we're talking about transportation, because public transportation comes up later in here is going to be huge. And that's one of our big opportunities that we don't want to miss again, as we have missed in the past, about repairing our public transit corridor up and down I-5. All of that's going to be built into what we do with the Nisqually Bridge. All of that's going to be do with what we do with how we plan from a zoning perspective and from a county perspective, as well as working with the Department of Transportation, and most importantly, Nisqually Nation in developing and preserving that area for a variety of uses. I think that's going to be both an area that we need to have a lot of opportunities, and it's going to be sort of the testing ground for a lot of these options.
And I'll assume you're using the royal we, since so much of that is outside the purview of Thurston County.
Yes, I'm talking about, I'm talking about this larger element.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, so much as we, as Thurston County has anything to say about that, we need to be prioritizing what we can do in terms of that.
Definitely.
And we do have a seat at the table.
Yeah.
At the table, at least, discussing the NEPA for the project. So we are actively engaged and will continue to engage both on that project as well as with the Nisqually Nation.
I think we have greater opportunities for participation than we currently pursue in that regard. There are, but I don't want to get into that right now, but there are other opportunities that we can use to get better funding and to be better connected and have more of a say in what goes on up and down the CLSC corridor.
I think that might be true, but I think that from a comp plan perspective, there is not anything in that area that our comp plan would actually apply to. Our comp plan doesn't tell the tribe what to do. Our comp plan doesn't tell the feds what to do. Comp plan doesn't tell DOT what to do. Well, to a certain degree it can, but not on that project. So I'm not sure how we could effectuate, I'm not sure how we could effectuate the comp plan into influencing that particular. Go ahead.
Oh, I appreciate you bringing that up. We have an entire Nisqually sub-area section that we want to be working on pretty heavily, and that is going to be directly relevant to these kinds of questions.
So where policies might make sense is work with our partners to identify opportunities for transportation projects that improve connectivity, habitat connectivity. And what that does, at least for our board, is say that it is worth staff resources to engage in these advisory group discussions, which are fairly intensive from a time perspective. So to that extent, it's like not a direct outcome, but at least it's a guiding document for the board and how they allocate where staff spends their time. Is that where you want staff spending time with WashDOT and all the other stakeholders, or is it best to spend it someplace else? As just a suggestion, as I'm interpreting it.
If opportunities for grants where, yes, it's the feds or the state that's doing the work, but they're willing to grant to the county to help work on those, being open to those opportunities makes sense. So an action item to, keep an eye out for those and work on them when they're available. I mean, anytime there's money available, it's worth going after for that kind of activity.
Mr. Bishop.
You never know.
I like those ideas you just shared and examples being shared by the commissioners. I think also in the comprehensive plan, there's an element we talked about of having to evaluate the historical negative impacts to certain ethnic groups and to try to mitigate for some of those where possible. So I think of it less as stuff that we have to convince maybe the tribe to do, or things that we could do to improve things. And so I do think we should ask them or engage with them about things that we could potentially do as a county to help. And I'm curious about you just mentioned the interaction on NEPA and back and forth advisement. There would have been quite a bit of discussion about the outreach and engagement with the tribe. Would that be something, I know before we get the full report, could there be in the next meeting or a meeting after that, but before that full report, you could share with us something about that communication and back and forth with the tribe?
Oh, yeah, I mean, so we attend our outreach to the tribe, all of the tribes. We don't focus it just on the comp plan. We're really just trying to be at the table and on a consistent basis. And so we attend all the monthly Nisqually River Council meetings, and they essentially have given us a few minutes at each meeting to give a comprehensive plan update. So this transportation project has obviously come up. Expansion of the National Wildlife Refuge has come up, and how they're considering climate impacts into the future. And so we're doing data sharing at this point to make sure, I mean, we actually have more local data than they do. And so we've been sharing our data with them to help inform their update to their strategic plan. So there's a lot of collaboration going on there that isn't necessarily focused on development of a few planning policies, but really trying to act on the policies we already have and show a level of commitment to that relationship and the importance of working towards shared goals.
When you had previously mentioned things like, or maybe it was, sorry, maybe other staff, I'd mentioned things like reaching out and asking for various tribes, multiple of them, input on everything. I remember when we were talking about the history of the section that we decided to delete or reference differently. We talked about asking them, and sometimes we got some feedback from some and others didn't give us feedback. Is that what you're talking about, the monthly Nisqually River Council meetings? Is that where that,
Nope.
or there's a totally
That's a whole separate one that one is just focused on, like, as chapters get drafted, they are pretty much the first reviewers of those, like the earliest
Sorry,
draft.
who's they?
Oh, so Nisqually, Squaxin, Chehalis tribes. So we've been meeting with them on a regular monthly basis, and then at the request of some of the tribes, I
So,
think.
I'm sorry. I
Yeah,
want to
having
clear,
follow-up
each
meetings.
of those tribes, each of those three tribes, you have one point of contact that you send stuff over and they, then share and then provide. At least.
Basically, they have they've identified a coordinator to work with us and then distribute it. And then give us feedback, and they've been great about giving us feedback and then having follow-up meetings, individual one-on-one follow-up meetings with members of our team if they have additional
When
questions.
they meet with members of the team, who do they tend to meet? I mean, you don't have to give like specific names, but in terms of like a level of
So this is staff to staff.
Okay.
We've had members of the Nisqually tribe come to planning commission meetings before to give direct input on particular issues, like with the recycled asphalt project down in Nisqually. David Trout came and talked to us, so they've been really good. They've been good partners with us on a lot of stuff.
Yeah, they've been great partners through this comp plan update process. Yeah, I mean, I don't have anything but good things to say about that working relationship.
I think it's awesome. It was just pointed out to me that they just had a big election. Nisqually tribe specifically had a big election and a big change. And, the very famous Willie Frank is no longer the chief and not even on the council anymore. And there's a brand new, I can't remember the last name, Choke, I believe, is brand new chair. So it's a big change. I wonder whether that'll impact anything with their policies and how they work with us and what they want from us.
So I think we're only halfway through the presentation.
Yeah,
so you
I
know.
just wanted to
I'm
yeah.
like.
I wanted to pull it back to that, basically, which is all I was gonna say, which is that I do think that tribal consultation specifically is a multi-point opportunity for impact and resilience. And so that's definitely a nexus point I would focus on there, and I want to get back to that later.
Sorry. Katie, if you want to continue. I don't know if it's Megan or Andrea at this point.
Yeah, we're gonna move into the greenhouse gas emissions reduction sub-element. But yeah, thank you all for these thoughts and ideas. And certainly if there are other thoughts that you have, feel free to connect with Ashley or Amelia, make sure we can get those. So I will now provide an overview and update on the greenhouse gas emissions reduction sub-element. I'm going to provide some quick background information just related to that commerce guidance that I mentioned earlier. So just as a reminder, the objective for the sub-element is to measure, reduce, and eliminate local greenhouse gas emissions and per capita VMT through these comp plan goals and policies. And the commerce guidance calls for the goals and policies to work toward an overall greenhouse gas emission reduction target of net zero emissions by 2050 on both a total and per capita basis, and that aligns with the state's greenhouse gas reduction target. And the guidance also stipulates that goals and policies should address at a minimum greenhouse gas emissions related to transportation, buildings and energy, and zoning and development sectors. So we'll of course be following this guidance with the climate element. And these are a few other requirements that Commerce specifies related to the sub-element. It has to reduce overall emissions within the jurisdiction without increasing emissions elsewhere. It must reduce per capita VMT without increasing emissions elsewhere. And then it also must prioritize reductions that benefit overburdened communities to maximize co-benefits. The guidance provides 3 different pathways for meeting these requirements, and they range from less to more detailed levels of analysis. The third pathway, creating a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, is recommended for counties required to create a reduction sub-element, which includes Thurston County. So that is the pathway that we're undergoing for this climate element, and I'll share with you the initial findings for that inventory in a moment. Generally, our approach to the sub-element will follow these key steps. So starting with determining the scope scale and identifying all local emission sources. So that's that inventory. Then setting emission reduction targets that align with the state targets, as I mentioned, developing measures and an implementation plan to achieve those targets, and then integrating those into the comprehensive plan, climate element, and evaluating progress. So I'm just going to walk through each of these steps. We are almost done with step 1. So that's kind of where we're at and what I can share today. And then we'll review our plan for the following steps. So our first step here is developing a greenhouse gas inventory. The development of a 2022 greenhouse gas emissions inventory is currently underway. And that includes a community-wide inventory and also one that focuses on emissions from county government operations. So these graphs here present the draft results from the Commerce-funded greenhouse gas emissions inventories for Thurston County. So you can see here that some of the key sources of emissions that we see according to this inventory include from building energy. You see that in the dark blue on the lower left-hand side. So electricity and natural gas. In the lighter blue on the upper left, you can see on-road vehicles. As we talked about earlier, that includes both passenger vehicles, but then also those bigger trucks and freight vehicles. We also include other sources like off-road equipment, aviation, and marine vessels and rails. So you can see those contributions there in the pie chart. Another key emission source for the county, according to this inventory, is tree loss. So land use conversion and the basically, the lost sequestration that results from tree loss. And also agriculture contributes to land use emissions. And then the orange slices that you see there include solid waste generation and disposal, and refrigerants and wastewater processes. On the county government side, There are a few key emission sources to note here. You see electricity and natural gas in the dark blue on the bottom, and those are associated with county facilities and energy use at county facilities, county government facilities. There also is a vehicle fleet that the county manages that also contributes to emissions that you can see there in the light blue. We also included employee commuting and the greenhouse gas emissions associated with county employees commuting. And then there's a closed landfill that is emitting methane. And so that is contributing to greenhouse gas emissions as well. And then emissions associated with wastewater treatment and water conveyance.
What
Maybe I'll
landfill
pause
is
here.
that?
Are there
The Hawks Ferry landfill, isn't it?
I thought you said closed landfill.
It's capped.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, everything from there goes elsewhere when you take it. About the landfill, I know that Ecology has just published new rules around methane capture. And about half, I think I read about half the landfills in the state will be required to do more to capture the landfill, both open and closed. Do you know if that affects the landfill here in Thurston County, that new rule?
I'm not sure if that particular landfill would be affected by that. The data that we get for the inventory is based on what's reported to the EPA. So if there were changes in that capture, then in the future, at least it would be reflected in that EPA reporting.
The report that I read said that this new state rule is more strict than the federal rule. And the reason I ask is that there is also a grant program funded by the Climate Commitment Act that if it were to impact our landfill here, it would also mean that the county is eligible to apply for grant funding to do the necessary work. So just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, thank you.
So real quick, on the on-road vehicles portion, is there a way to disaggregate that for earlier conversations? Passenger, commercial, and maybe public transportation?
Yeah, we do have that disaggregated by those different sectors. I don't have it on the PowerPoint, but I can give you the statistics that I have. So according to the data that we received, about 71% of the on-road transportation emissions are from passenger and light duty vehicles, 9% from medium duty, 20% from heavy duty, and then about 1% from transit buses.
Thank you.
Data they're pulling from the EPA, it's pretty granular.
Well, I'd love to see it.
Like there's even a
your
simple for
question?
motorcycles.
You mentioned under tree loss that there's, you referenced that there was land use conversion. Is there any way to separate, or do you have any data about how much of that 20% for tree loss is made up of land use conversion versus maybe a percentage for commercial timber cuts, a percentage for fires, other possible breakouts?
Yeah, we use a remote sensing tool for that, and it does break down the contributions from different types of changes, including change from forest to other land types like settlement or grassland is a category that they have as well, and it includes reforestation, and then any emissions associated with fire, insects, diseases, harvesting, for example. So I'm happy to follow up data if you're interested.
Very.
I can confidently report that agriculture is not responsible for that tree loss. The VSP monitoring report found less than 0.1% of any change in forest lands in critical areas.
I had a related question about agriculture. Does that not include or does include ranching? And I've heard a bunch of weird statements about cows and that they create a lot of methane and that it's not from cow poo, it's from them burping and all these weird theories. And I don't know what's the truth behind that, but that it's, I've heard, considered one of the larger emissions
Yeah, it's the
profiles.
the cows themselves emitting it, that's most of it. I mean, like, as opposed to their waste, but I don't know how much that's being reflected.
Yeah, it's only 2%.
We don't have a lot
Well,
of
is that true? Is that part of the agriculture section?
I
Yeah,
don't know. We don't, yeah. I'll let
we
them
do
say.
it. It does include emissions associated with livestock, which includes cows, and within that we account for enteric fermentation, which is basically cow farts, and
More likely, but
and then also manure management and emissions associated with manure management. It also includes cropland and emissions associated with fertilizer runoff.
I guess this gets back to a different, the question about tree loss and agriculture, but we've kind of gone back and forth in this commission when we're talking about tree lots and timber harvesting, whether we're counting that as agriculture, whether counting that as protected forest. And I'm wondering how you are counting that on here as an emission source. Is a tree lot considered agriculture? Is it considered forest that is lost as it's logged? What's going on with that?
In this inventory, it is included in tree loss.
you.
Agriculture focuses on crop and agriculture, but not forestry.
Cool. I know we're running late, but just to make sure that we understand, it's a complex situation with livestock. Cows on the landscape exist in a symbiotic relationship with methanotropic organisms that actually digest and get rid of the methane in their life cycles. So there's more to it.
Well, and they're a key component of our implementation of our habitat conservation program.
Yep.
Prairie restoration.
Absolutely.
Our prairies wouldn't exist right now without our livestock.
The way that ruminants are managed on the landscape could dramatically increase carbon sequestration in grasslands. So
Or decrease it. It depends on how this is done.
it's about
entirely
management.
Context.
Yeah, it's about management. Anyway, Mr. Casino.
I was hoping you could tell us what percentage of community greenhouse gas emissions are the county's greenhouse gas emissions.
What slice of us is them? That's actually really interesting.
That's a good question.
That's a good question. I don't have that number at my fingertips. I can give you some total numbers, and then you could potentially do the math. Total emissions for the community is about 4.2 million. And then I have to look up the municipal. Give me 1 second.
The next question, of course, would be what about our other municipal partners?
How do we compare?
To the cities? I'm assuming they're doing worse than us.
I will say that for this, we gathered the data that we had available. In some cases, we did not have data available across all the sectors that we are looking for. So for Thurston County, I believe we did not get data related to business travel for the county government emissions or for county generation of solid waste. So that's just based on what's already available and being tracked by the county currently. So this pie chart that we have here represents the data that we had available to be able to estimate.
So you didn't have a whole number for the county then?
There were a couple of sectors where, yeah, we didn't have the data available to include it.
Of what you were able to calculate, can you tell us how much that was?
Yes, I am opening up the workbook right now. My computer's a little slow here. Okay, so for county operations, looks like 12,000 metric tons. So usually the county government operations is a very small, less than 1% of the community-wide emissions.
Next question would be, how much does the state government offices?
Yeah.
About 0.5%. And can you tell us, Lacey?
No, it's continue,
I
please.
cannot.
Andrea.
Yes. Unless we want to take a break to all call our loved ones and tell them we'll be late. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll keep things moving here. So based on that emissions profile, you know, what we glean from that is where there could be areas of focus in terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction opportunities. So for the community emissions, focus on opportunities to reduce vehicle transport and shift to lower carbon transportation modes, reduce building energy consumption, shift to renewable energy sources and electricity sources, and minimize tree loss. And then for the county government, opportunities potentially to reduce emissions by reducing facility energy use, shifting to those renewable energy sources, shifting employee commuting to lower carbon modes, and as we mentioned, improving that methane capture technology at that landfill.
Remote work coming at all. Remote work, yeah. It has its downsides too, particularly for HVAC. But
so I'll just go through the next steps here, and then I want to spend a moment just talking about some potential example policies for consideration, and would love to hear your thoughts on those. So the next step here would be focusing in on reduction targets, taking that inventory and using that to determine what then will be required in terms of emission reductions to align with the state target of that net zero emission by 2050. As part of this, we would develop measures and implementation plan to achieve targets. So we would develop those measures drawing from multiple sources, including public and stakeholder engagement, that policy audit that I mentioned earlier, the inventory and the VMT analysis, the menu of measures provided by Commerce that I mentioned as a resource that's available to us. And we're also going to be utilizing a scenario analysis tool that you can see on the right here that can help visualize future greenhouse gas emissions projections and the impact that various climate strategies can have on reducing emissions in the future toward meeting those goals. Those measures will then be incorporated into a draft sub-element that would be integrated across the other comprehensive plan elements, would coordinate various county departments and agencies, and would also provide a plan for emissions monitoring and reporting every time. And Commerce requires that you assess emissions reduction progress every 5 years at a minimum. So we would include that in the plan as well. So quickly moving into the policies here. So as I mentioned, we would be drawing from different information sources in order to draft these policies. And this slide presents some example goals and policies for the 3 focus areas for the greenhouse gas emission reduction sub-element. First, focusing on the built environment. So promoting building development and management practices that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, enhance energy efficiency, and support environmental justice. Some example policies that could be considered in here include coordinating long-term planning for future infill and urban sprawl reduction, and increasing the percentage of all households in the county within a half mile of an urban center, corridor, or neighborhood center. Also related is reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector. So this would include policies such as increasing the adoption of electric vehicles, using policies, incentives, and education, and introducing a public fleet vehicle replacement policy. And then we have carbon sequestration as a focus area here. That involves supporting greenhouse gas emission reductions and land carbon sequestration through agriculture and forestry practices and increased tree canopy cover. So potential policies here include educating farmers on regenerative agriculture practices and developing a coordinated reforestation, afforestation program. So I'd love to hear any thoughts related to these focus areas, example policies. I also have a discussion question here. You know, we noted from our policy audit that there are a lot of VMT reduction strategies already in place across the county's different planning documents. You know, given that transportation sector continues to be a major source of emissions, are there additional ideas for VMT reduction strategies that we could include in this climate element? Would love to hear ideas you have there.
It sounds like you're requesting a question here. I also had a question about that previous slide. So if you wouldn't mind going back to it really quick. Just in terms of transportation, I guess like I don't even see like public listed under example. I mean, like it has not come up as a thing. I guess public increasing the adoption of electric vehicles is great, but that just displaces a lot of the emissions to conveniently out of state, but to areas of extraction. I really hope that we are really discussing a lot more public transit under those kinds of example policies. And I know that comes up on the next slide too. So I just wanted to place that under our consideration.
So there is a limit, the intercity transit strategic plan covering really none of the rural area. However, having said that, we're in conversations with Thurston Regional Planning Council about the rural transit option they provide in South County. And so, and looking for exploring different partnerships about how to maintain that long term, because right now it's not sustainable, and how to expand it. So I would say if the way it could be framed is like alternative public transportation options rather than transit, because people think fixed bus on a fixed route, and that's really hard to provide in a rural area. And that's really within intercity's purview, but there's definitely models. King County has one, Pierce County offers a bunch of stuff that we could look at.
I think this also gets directly into the comment, one of the public comments that was talking about folks who are trapped rather than choose rural living, who are positioned in those areas, which that is a huge source of emissions. And specifically talking about when we're talking about clustered housing or we're talking about condensed housing, they made an excellent point about how that needs to be focused more on this. We need to be putting a little bit more push on the cities to be, and even the rural cities to be working on that. But transit's going to be a huge aspect of that. Transit, like making sure that people are clustered in such a way, however they're clustered, that transit is accessible to them in whatever form that it takes. And I recognize that's not all going to be IT.
So I just want to make sure the Planning Commission understands that clustered housing in a rural environment is really, a better term is conservation subdivision. You're taking homes that would already be allowed to be built at that particular density and just putting them in a smaller footprint so that you can conserve your farms and your forest lands rather than creating small cities.
I agree.
And they're fairly low density still. I mean, you're still talking like maybe 10 to 12 units together rather than hundreds. That would be a big cluster. Actually, currently, because we currently have cluster development standards, it's no more than 6 units.
Can you say the name again, conservation what?
Conservation subdivision. Cluster development's really, it's in my mind is more of an urban term. We call it planned rural residential development here in the county. And if you want to like look at models for it, you're better off searching things like conservation subdivision.
Yeah, I think that we're going to need to take this seriously. I mean, you guys are doing a lot of work on that, but like, we're going to need some drastic and weird looking measures. And one of the drastic and weird looking measures is going to be, expanding things like clusters or conservation subdivisions beyond what they're traditionally considered and actually treating those as a little bit more of, infrastructure hubs.
So you had mentioned intercity transit, and, one of the things that I heard from somebody working at intercity transit was that there had been transit zones, maybe transit agreement zones, something like that. But some of the smaller rural cities had chosen not to participate in them.
Yeah. Yep. So there, if you look at, it's almost like a old-fashioned the Beaver Hat, it's like the North County cities and then they operate some express service down to Yelm.
Yeah, well, tonight apparently had chosen to participate in one of these zones, but I just wonder if there's some way to incentivize the smaller cities actually participating in those zones.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, there's yeah, we can definitely chant more, and we have a whole transportation chapter, so in addition to the climate element, there's a transportation chapter where we can have those conversations.
Yeah, I was thinking about it with a specific respect to climate.
Yeah.
The other thing I had a question about here was in terms of public fleet. Sorry guys. Does that include sheriff? I recently saw a sheriff's department using Teslas actually.
Like pit
Yeah, I
maneuvers
think
in a
it
Tesla
could
sound
include
great.
all.
It's in a Tesla.
So that does include all public, including law.
That's right.
Yeah, we have a centralized fleet administration, so they would be accounting for that.
Yeah, I guess just to wrap this up, so I know we have a lot more we want to get into. I'm just encouraging that like we pull the focus away from electric vehicle adoption on a widespread like individualist level, and we look a lot more at these more risk or these more collective cost issues for lower income folks, which are going to be a lot more transit oriented.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, Commissioner Peshinger.
If you want to leave, maybe you should, because I'm gonna definitely ask a question here. It's not gonna be short. You all are planners. I come from the background of corporate strategic planning, and the first question you ask is bang for your buck. And when you look at that, you always look at what are the biggest categories. And on this chart, this pie chart on slide 28, your biggest 4 categories equals 82%. Now I see on slide 35, GHG emissions reduction sub-element and 3 focus areas. Built environment, I don't even know where that shows up on this pie chart.
Probably in electricity and natural gas.
Yeah.
Maybe. I wanted to ask about electricity. Is that when it says 26% electricity, is that based off of the different sources of where the electricity is created from, or the transmission of the electricity, the usage of the electricity, all of the above?
It includes the emissions associated with producing and transmitting that electricity to the end user.
And natural gas, I presume, is for mostly, we don't produce it here, so it must be mostly transportation and home heating and backyard barbecues and whatnot.
Yeah, it does include, so it's whatever's emitted from actually burning that natural gas for whatever it's being used for. So yeah, for stoves or furnaces or whatnot. And then it also assumes that there's some amount of leakage in the transmission line to get that natural gas from wherever it's being produced to the home. So it takes those 2 into account.
Cool. I do see, so maybe these are more represented in these top 4 categories, but I would recommend putting as much focus as possible on the areas we can have the biggest impact, and tree loss is certainly one. Electrical usage, on-road vehicles, and natural gas all seem like they have a large number of opportunities to have bigger impacts.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, we tried to focus on the areas where we knew there were the most emissions needed to be reduced.
I'm going to really quick just redirect this back to my pet project and say that in terms of bang for our buck, I do think that we're going to get a lot out of looking at connectivity and corridor as a method of reforestation and as a method of sequestration, as well as development mitigation. So that's something I would really like to see a little bit more on. I was also wondering within natural gas production specifically, it occurred to me that we're supposed to be talking about this within the context of Washington, whether it's increasing our net emissions here. And since natural gas is to at least some degree being produced and distributed through the rest of Washington, it seems like it has an aggregated effect. When you're looking at its larger cost outside of us just spending the carbon here, because we're also producing that carbon in other parts of Washington, and that's that distributed effect that's referenced right at the beginning. I was wondering if that was taken into account at all, but if it's not, it should be.
Thanks. Just to clarify, so if the production of natural gas elsewhere is taken into account, would you mind clarifying?
Yes,
Restating that?
so the production of natural gas is not happening within Thurston County, but it is happening within Washington State. The transportation of the natural gas is also mostly happening outside of Thurston County, but is affecting Washington State. And I do know that one of the goals with this is that we're not increasing our emissions in a statewide perspective. So it does seem like something that is relevant as a larger aspect of the emissions as displaced emissions, even if it's not the literal emission coming out of the state.
Yeah, as I mentioned, this takes into account the natural gas that is burned on site for whatever the application is, and then it doesn't include some pipeline emissions. There are ways that you could potentially quantify the upstream emissions associated with that natural gas production process. That's not included here, but yeah, presumably that would be captured in wherever that's being produced. That would be captured in that inventory or accounting to add up to the entire state level. But no, that's not being included here.
Thank you.
Are we pretty much done with the slides with content, substantive content?
Yeah, the only other slides we had were just touching on next steps. So happy to go through those. That makes sense this
Please.
time? Okay, great. Well, yeah, thank you all for your input and discussion. It's really helpful for us as we move into these next steps here. So county staff are reviewing the draft climate element policies in July, and our tentative plan here is to bring those draft policies to Planning Commission at 2 additional touch points. Right now, thinking August and late September. And the goal will be to have a public comment draft of the element by end of September. So that's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you very much to you and your team for the presentation tonight.
We did give them fair warning that we have a very engaged planning.
Well, next on our agenda is General Thurston 2045 update. Ashley, do what you must.
I think we're good. I do have
Okay.
some staff updates, but I
Okay,
think we're
let's
probably
move
good.
to staff updates.
Really quick, Amelia here is actually working on an update to the flood hazard mitigation plan. It's a light touch, but just wanted to make sure you were aware, and if you know of anybody that is very
Mitigation plan?
flood hazard. So there was a reference to the hazards mitigation plan, and we're special in that we do two different mitigation plans. So this one's specifically focused on floods. It's not something that comes through the planning commission. However, we just wanted to make you aware of it. There is a website and there's information over on the table there if you want to take a look at it, or if there are others you know that would be interested in that. And like I said, it's kind of a light touch update. There was a very big effort when it was drafted. When was it drafted?
It was last updated in 2017.
Is it?
Is Howard involved in that?
Yes.
Okay.
He will be.
Yeah, he
Yeah,
will
well-
be. Yeah, we're just starting the process. It'll be due probably next summer.
Is this based on the recent FEMA study that was just concluded?
There's a number of different FEMA updates.
It's based on, it's out of date and we're updating a lot of data and maps.
Okay.
So
I know
it's a
Kevin was
standard
invo-
update.
Yeah, Kevin was involved in the FEMA flood risk study that was done here for Thurston County.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
It's gonna be
he's,
pulling in a lot of people.
yeah, he's aware of this and we're working closely with him, and others on his team as well as emergency
What
management.
capacity of people are you looking forward to do?
Well, just right now, it's letting you know about it.
Uh-huh.
So I'm not actually asking for much out of anyone besides myself right now.
Just another parallel planning effort that we will be engaged in.
We don't have enough of those.
But a light touch one. And then not all of you know this near and dear person to us, but for those of you who do, Jeremy Davis announced his retirement. And I know, oh,
Okay.
it was
I mean,
supposed
listen,
to be shared at your staff meeting this morning. It was just shared yesterday, but I know that there are folks here that really appreciate Jeremy and might want to, I don't know, put together like a card or something to wish him well. This is a huge, like, they met their goal years earlier than they thought they were going to. And it is definitely something to celebrate as much as he is going to be missed. And the response of our staff has either been yay or I'm not talking to you, I'm so upset. So
When's his last day?
it's not until like early October. So we have time, but I just wanted to share it. So if you see him, you can give him a big high five.
So his position is gonna be coming open for Bill.
He's
Yeah.
operations though.
He's operations, he feels kind of this quasi role of someone who has an amazing planning background as well as so good at process. So yes, we will be looking to fill that role. We're already working on a transition plan. But just wanted to make sure that was on your radar. And that's it. We had great interviews for our, specialists, that's currently open. And so we're hoping to be able to make an offer here within the next week or two.
Great. Calendar with agenda items. How do we usually do this? Just check calendars and see if folks think they might not be able to attend. August 7th, anyone aware that they
I
won't?
likely won't be able to. It all really depends on when I can get my mom to the airport.
Okay,
I may try to attend remotely. I can't guarantee anything.
August 21st. I know that I will be landing in DC and I'll try and attend remotely, but I just don't know what that'll look like. Okay. Well, we'll have quorum at both those meetings, so that's the important part. For the good of the order, I would just say a tremendous amount of appreciation for the staff that has to be here right now. And sorry for running so long tonight.
It was a short agenda, one item.
We can do that. Maybe I can do better next time.
Slides and a hot
A lot of slides.
But anything else for the good of the order?
The Squally River Council meetings this Friday. We've discussed it, we've repeatedly discussed the context around it, so if people are showing up, I'm going to be there. Let's
They're
not,
so good.
yeah, let's not have an accidental quorum, but whoever wants to show up should show up.
I'd like to in the future. I'll be at Cub Scout camp this Friday, but I'd love to know about them in the future.
They have the coolest presentations. They really do.
I'm looking forward to it. It's worth being up at 9 in the morning for.
And say hi to Brian. He'll be there.
Okay. Having no further business, this meeting is adjourned.